It was the 11th of November, 1918, at exactly the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Across the trenches of France and Belgium, exhausted soldiers lowered their rifles and stared into the silence. 16 million lives had already been lost. Empires had collapsed. And though the war was over, the peace that followed was anything but secure. Before we continue, if you truly enjoy the stories I create, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep history alive. Your screen will now slowly fade to black. That's intentional. Artificial light can disturb your rest, so let the darkness protect your sleep. Put on your headphones, turn on your fan for a gentle hum, pull up your blanket and get comfortable. Now, let us begin our story. In Germany, the news of defeat landed like a hammer. Just days earlier, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the supreme commander of the German armies, had abdicated. He fled into exile in the Netherlands, leaving a nation stunned and leaderless. In Berlin, red flags waved as workers and soldiers formed councils hoping to model their country after the Russian Revolution of the previous year. But Germany would not become a Bolshevik state. Instead, a fragile new government was proclaimed, the Weimar Republic. This republic began life under terrible strain. The German army, once proud, marched home, not in triumph, but in humiliation. Many officers insisted they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by weak politicians at home. This claim, the so-called stab-in-the-back myth, would poison German politics for decades. It was a dangerous seed planted in bitterness, and one that future demagogues would eagerly cultivate. Meanwhile, the victors gathered in Paris. In January 1919, statesmen from across the world met at the Palace of Versailles. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with lofty ideals. He spoke of a new world order, where disputes would be settled by dialogue instead of gunfire. His proposal, the League of Nations, promised a framework for lasting peace, but in the marble halls of Versailles, justice mixed uneasily with vengeance. France demanded security against another German invasion. Britain sought to preserve its empire. Italy demanded territory it had been promised, and all agreed that Germany must pay. The treaty stripped Germany of its colonies, reduced its military to just 1,000,000 men, and demanded staggering reparations, £6.6 billion. Sterling, a sum so vast that it seemed designed not to be repaid, but to cripple. The treaty also reshaped the map of Europe. From the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire emerged Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Independence returned to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. On paper, Europe looked remade. But beneath the surface, old tensions remained. In the Sudetenland, Germans now lived under Czech rule. In Poland, Germans bristled at a new border that cut off East Prussia. Nationalism, once unleashed, did not disappear. It merely waited. Ordinary Germans felt crushed. Their economy, already shattered by wartime blockade, faced ruin. Inflation began to climb. Veterans, jobless and embittered, roamed the streets in paramilitary groups. Street clashes erupted between communists and right-wing nationalists. Every side accused the others of betrayal. The Weimar Republic, only months old, looked fragile from the very start. Across the Atlantic, Wilson's dream of global unity collapsed almost immediately. The U.S. Congress refused to ratify membership in the League of Nations. America turned inward, unwilling to risk more sons on European battlefields. Without the weight of the world's rising power, the League was little more than words on paper. When the first crises came, it would prove powerless. Still in 1919, most Europeans wanted desperately to believe in peace. Soldiers returned home. Families tried to rebuild shattered lives. Children played in streets where tanks had once rumbled. But beneath this fragile normalcy, the anger of a defeated nation smoldered. In Munich, beer halls, in veterans' clubs, in secret political meetings, voices whispered that Germany had been betrayed, that only strong new leaders could restore pride. Those voices would not remain whispers for long. What is the peace that promised stability after 1919 instead became the cradle of extremism? The world hoped that the guns of the Great War had ended all wars, but for millions of Germans, the 1922nd brought humiliation, turmoil, and fertile ground for dangerous ideas. Germany's new Weimar Republic opened its eyes to a harsh reality. Reparations, payments drained resources. French troops occupied the Ruhr in 1923 when Germany fell behind on deliveries of coal. Workers went on strike and the government tried to pay them with newly printed money. The result was a disaster. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control. Prices doubled not in years but in days. By November, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Savings vanished overnight. Families pushed wheelbarrows full of worthless notes to buy groceries. Teachers were paid in cash at lunchtime so they could rush to spend it before prices rose again. These scenes of absurd desperation scarred a generation. Many ordinary citizens concluded that democracy had failed them. Veterans, humiliated by defeat and now unable to feed their families, turned to paramilitary groups. On the left, communists clashed with police inspired by Moscow. On the right, monarchists and nationalists vowed revenge against the traitors of 1918. Streets filled with marches, fistfights, and gunfire. Berlin, in the early 1922nd, often felt like a city at war with itself. In this climate, a failed artist from Austria began to find his voice. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier decorated in the Great War, joined a small nationalist movement in Munich, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In smoky beer halls, his fiery speeches mesmerized audiences. He spoke of betrayal, of the stab in the back of enemies within. He promised to restore pride, punish the guilty, and make Germany great again. By 1923, his confidence grew into reckless ambition. That November, he and his followers marched through Munich in an attempted coup, the beer hall putsch. Police gunfire cut it short. 16 Nazis lay dead. Hitler was arrested and tried for treason. Yet even in failure, he gained national fame. The judge allowed him to speak for hours. Newspapers spread his words across Germany. Instead of silencing him, the trial turned him into a martyr for nationalist causes. In prison, Hitler wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, ATA, part autobiography, part political program. It blamed Germany's woes on Jews, communists, and foreign powers. It called for rebuilding military strength and seizing land in the East. Most dismissed it as the ramblings of a fanatic. But for those who longed for direction in chaos, it offered a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, other strongmen rose. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already seized power in 1922. A former socialist turned nationalist, he founded the fascist party and led his blackshirts in a march on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel invited him to form a government rather than risk civil war. Within a few years, Mussolini dismantled democracy and ruled as dictator. He built highways, drained marshes, and launched massive public work. Many Italians admired his efficiency, and foreign observers hailed him as a model of firm leadership. His experiment gave inspiration to Hitler and other right-wing movements across Europe. But the Weimar Republic was not doomed yet. In the mid-1922, Germany experienced brief stability. International loans under the Dawes Plan eased reparations. The currency was reformed. Jazz clubs, cabarets, and cinemas flourished in Berlin, creating a vibrant cultural scene that shocked conservatives but attracted global admiration. Women gained new freedoms. Intellectuals, artists, and writers made Weimar Germany a hub of creativity. Still, this stability was fragile. Extremists never disappeared. Nationalist groups simmered in the background, recruiting the disillusioned. Hitler, released from prison after only 9 months, quietly rebuilt the Nazi Party. He changed tactics, focusing on elections rather than street coups. His movement remained small, but it was disciplined, organized, and waiting. As the 1922 drew to a close, the world seemed to be enjoying peace. The League of Nations proclaimed international cooperation. The United States boomed with jazz skyscrapers and new wealth. Germany, though humbled, was finding its rhythm again. Yet beneath the surface, resentment remained. The Treaty of Versailles was still hated. Inflation had left scars, and extremist leaders were sharpening their message. Then, across the Atlantic, events would shift the balance once more. In 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed. Billions vanished in hours. The Great Depression spread across oceans like a shock wave. In Germany, fragile stability collapsed overnight. Banks closed. Unemployment soared to 6 million. Families queued for soup. The brief golden age was gone. And as hunger returned, so did the appeal of extremists. The Nazis, once a fringe party, now surged in popularity. Hitler's time was coming. What if the world's greatest economic collapse became the engine of its greatest war in the 1932nd a decade that should have been about recovery, instead saw fragile democracies stagger empires, tremble, and dictatorships tighten their grip? The Great Depression hit with a violence few had imagined. It began with the Wall Street crash of October 1929. Within days, fortunes evaporated, factories shut down, banks failed, farmers lost their land. In the United States, unemployment rose above 25%. Men lined up for bread in cities that only months earlier had symbolized prosperity. Shanty towns, nicknamed Hoovervilles, spread across the nation. The shock waves traveled quickly. International loans dried up. Global trade collapsed by 2/3. No country escaped untouched. Germany, already fragile from reparations, was devastated. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. The Weimar Republic's leaders seemed powerless. Moderate parties lost credibility. Extremists, promising radical solutions, surged. The Nazis, once ridiculed as thugs in brown shirts, now drew millions to their rallies. Hitler's message that Germany's suffering came from betrayal Jews and the Treaty of Versailles resonated with the desperate. His party became the largest in the Reichstag. Political deadlock paralyzed the government. In January 1933, the aging President Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler Chancellor, hoping to control him. Within months, Hitler consolidated power, outlawed rivals, and declared himself Führer. Meanwhile, far to the east, Japan also turned crisis into conquest. Its population was exploding. Its economy depended on imports of food and raw materials, yet the Depression strangled access. Military leaders argued that survival required expansion. In 1931, without even informing their own civilian government, Japanese officers staged the Mukden incident, a staged attack on a railway in Manchuria. Using it as an excuse, they occupied the region and declared a puppet state Manchukuo under the last emperor of China, Puyi. The League of Nations condemned the aggression. Japan simply walked out. The message was clear. The League had no power to stop determined aggressors. In China, resistance was chaotic. Chiang Kai, Shek's nationalist government, was locked in civil war against Mao Zedong's communists. Despite their rivalry, both were forced to resist the Japanese onslaught. The brutality shocked the world. In 1937, Japanese forces captured Nanjing. Over the next 6 weeks, an estimated 3,000,000 civilians were massacred, and tens of thousands of women were raped. Westerners in China sent desperate reports, but the democracies paralyzed by their own economic troubles did little more than protest. Italy also seized the moment. Mussolini dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. Modern artillery and aircraft overwhelmed Ethiopian troops, armed with rifles and spears. Italian planes even dropped poison gas, banned since World War I. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but they were half-hearted. Britain and France, fearing war with Italy, avoided oil embargoes. Ethiopia fell, and Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile, warning that it is us today, it will be you tomorrow. To ordinary Americans, these distant crises felt remote. In the early 1932nd, the United States turned inward. The priority was recovery from the Depression, not foreign entanglements. Isolationism ran deep. Congress passed neutrality acts to keep America out of wars. But even from afar, Americans watched the rise of militarism with unease. Newsreels showed Nazi rallies at Nuremberg, tens of thousands of men in perfect rows, saluting as Hitler shouted promises of destiny. Radio broadcasts carried reports of Japanese bombers over Shanghai. The world seemed to be sliding towards something ominous. Britain and France, the supposed guardians of peace, hesitated. Memories of World War I haunted them. Nearly 1 million British and 1.5 million French soldiers had died in the trenches. Few politicians dared risk another bloodbath. Their armies remained underfunded, their economies weak, their populations weary. To many leaders, appeasement, making concessions in hopes of preserving peace, seemed the only option. But appeasement also gave aggressors confidence. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, directly violating Versailles. French troops could have marched in and stopped him. His own generals admitted they would have had to retreat. But France, divided by politics and fearful of war, stayed put. Britain protested diplomatically but did nothing. Hitler exulted. Each risk he took without punishment emboldened him further. The world was tilting. Democracies burdened by fear and economic pain hesitated. Dictatorships fueled by ideology and ambition advanced. By the late 1932nd, 3 revisionist powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, stood aligned by similar goals: expansion, revenge, and dominance. The League of Nations, created to prevent war, was exposed as powerless. For ordinary people, the 1932nd were a time of confusion. In Berlin, factories reopened under Nazi programs, unemployment fell, and many cheered the revival. In Tokyo, military parades gave a sense of pride, even as soldiers marched off to brutal campaigns. In Rome, Mussolini boasted of empire while silencing dissent. Meanwhile, in Paris and London, citizens hoped against hope that the threats could be managed with words, not war. The stage was set. The Depression had shaken economies, discredited democracies, and opened the door for radical solutions. The dictators had tested the world, and the world had blinked. What if a single fire, lit in a parliament chamber, gave one man absolute control of a nation? In early 1933, Germany was still a democracy on paper, but within months it would be transformed into a dictatorship built on fear, loyalty, and spectacle. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, many Germans still underestimated him. President Hindenburg and conservative elites believed they could use him, restrain him, and ride his popularity to stabilize the nation. But Hitler had no intention of being restrained. His party already commanded millions of devoted followers, and he wasted no time turning that loyalty into political dominance. On the 27th of February 1933, flames engulfed the Reichstag, the German parliament building in Berlin. A young Dutch communist was arrested at the scene, but whether he acted alone or was framed remains debated. For Hitler, the fire was a gift. He declared that Germany faced a communist conspiracy. That night he persuaded Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree suspending civil liberties. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly were abolished. Police could search homes without warrant. Thousands of political opponents, communists, socialists, liberals, were arrested. Weeks later, Hitler pushed the Reichstag to pass the Enabling Act, granting him power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Surrounded by stormtroopers, most legislators voted yes. Only the Social Democrats resisted. With that single vote, democracy in Germany effectively ended. Hitler now wielded unchecked authority. From there he moved quickly. Trade unions were outlawed. Rival political parties were banned. State governments were brought under Nazi control. Even cultural life was reshaped. Books deemed un-German were burned in public squares, while propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels filled theaters and radios with Nazi ideology. Children joined the Hitler Youth. The press echoed only one voice. In less than a year, the Weimar Republic had been erased. After President Hindenburg's death in August 1934, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor. He declared himself Führer, the supreme leader. The army swore not to the Constitution but personally to him. Dissent inside the Nazi ranks was crushed. During the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, Hitler ordered the murder of rivals within his own movement, including leaders of the paramilitary SA who had grown too powerful. The message was clear. Loyalty belonged to him alone. Once political control was secured, Hitler turned to military power. The Treaty of Versailles had limited Germany's army to 1,000,000 men and banned aircraft, tanks, and submarines. For years, these restrictions had been ignored quietly. Now Hitler flaunted his defiance. In 1935, he announced the creation of a new air force, the Luftwaffe, already boasting thousands of planes. He reintroduced conscription, swelling the army to more than 500,000 soldiers. German factories worked around the clock, producing tanks and weapons. Britain and France protested but weakly. Still scarred by World War I, they hesitated to act. To many citizens, it seemed only fair that Germany should defend itself again. Few realized that Hitler's true goal was not defense, but conquest. The Nazi regime also revealed its racial agenda. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped German Jews of citizenship and banned marriages or relations between Jews and Aryans. Jews were excluded from schools, professions, and public life. These laws formalized discrimination into national policy. Anti-Jewish propaganda spread through classrooms and newspapers. Though violence was limited in these early years, the foundation for persecution and later genocide was laid. Meanwhile, Hitler cultivated a public image of triumph. He launched massive public works programs, highways, stadiums, housing projects. Unemployment plummeted. Ordinary Germans saw their nation recovering from the despair of the Depression. International visitors marveled at the Autobahn. In 1936, the Berlin Olympics showcased a modern, confident Germany. Foreign journalists admired the order and discipline, often ignoring the repression beneath. For many Germans, life seemed to be improving if you belonged to the right race, party, or ideology. By 1935, Hitler stood as an absolute ruler with a revitalized army and a population largely behind him. He had silenced opposition, rearmed the nation, and embedded his ideology deep into schools, workplaces, and even family life. What began with a fire in a parliament had become a furnace reshaping a nation. And beyond Germany's borders, his gaze was shifting. The Versailles Treaty had been defied openly, and no one had stopped him. His next moves would not be about rebuilding, but expanding. What if the world's last chance to stop aggression before it spread across continents slipped away in the African highlands? In 1935, Benito Mussolini tested the will of the international community. The result was not only the conquest of Ethiopia, but the demonstration that collective security was an illusion. Mussolini had risen to power a decade earlier, promising to restore Italy's greatness. He spoke of reviving the Roman Empire of seas filled with Italian warships of colonies stretching across Africa. Italy already held Eritrea and Somaliland on the Horn of Africa. Between them lay Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, an independent kingdom with a long history, mountainous terrain, and a proud people. Its emperor Haile Selassie ruled a nation that had resisted European domination when others had fallen. To Mussolini, conquering Ethiopia was more than strategy. It was prestige. In December 1934, Italian and Ethiopian troops clashed at the oasis of WWII deep inside Ethiopian territory. The incident was small, but Mussolini used it as a pretext. He claimed that Italian honor had been insulted. Over the following months, he poured tens of thousands of troops into Eritrea and Somaliland. Tanks, artillery, and modern aircraft assembled along Ethiopia's borders. It was a build-up for a colonial war disguised as punishment. The League of Nations, headquartered in Geneva, faced its first true test. Haile Selassie appealed directly to the League. He stood before its assembly, a dignified figure in traditional robes, and pleaded, "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." His message was clear. If aggression went unchecked here, no nation would be safe. But the League was paralyzed. Britain and France, the two great democracies that had once promised to protect weaker nations, hesitated. Both feared driving Mussolini into alliance with Hitler, who was still consolidating power in Germany. Both wanted to preserve their Mediterranean interests. So they stalled. The League voted for sanctions, bans on arms sales, on credit, on rubber and tin. But the one sanction that could have stopped Mussolini, an oil embargo, was never applied. Without oil, Italian tanks and aircraft would have ground to a halt. Yet Britain and France refused, fearing Mussolini might retaliate by closing the Suez Canal, their lifeline to empire. In October 1935, Mussolini struck. Italian troops surged into Ethiopia from the north and east. The Ethiopian army fought bravely, but it was no match. Many soldiers carried rifles from the 19th century, others spears. Against them came modern artillery tanks and the roar of Fiat bombers. The Italian Air Force bombed villages indiscriminately. Worse, they dropped chemical weapons. Mustard gas, outlawed by international treaties after World War I, fell from the skies onto soldiers and civilians alike. Fields were poisoned, wells contaminated. By May 1936, Italian forces had reached the capital Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From the balcony of Rome's Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini announced that Ethiopia was now part of a new Italian empire. Crowds roared in approval. The conquest had been brutal, but for Mussolini it was proof boldness worked, and the world would do nothing. The reaction abroad was telling. The League condemned but did not act. Britain and France maintained their empires while denouncing Mussolini for building his. Many smaller nations watched in dismay. Collective security, the great promise of Versailles, looked like a hollow phrase. For Germany, the lesson was invaluable. Hitler studied Mussolini's success carefully. If the League could not stop Italy in Africa, how could it stop Germany in Europe? He understood that words without force meant opportunity. Already he was preparing his next moves, the Rhineland, Austria, and beyond. For Ethiopia, the cost was enormous. Tens of thousands were killed, villages were destroyed, families were displaced. The scars of occupation would linger for decades. But Haile Selassie's voice still echoed. In exile, he continued to warn that the failure to confront fascism in Africa would embolden fascism in Europe. In Washington, Americans followed the events with mixed feelings. Newspapers reported Italian bombing raids and leaked debates. Public sympathy leaned toward Ethiopia, but isolationist sentiment remained strong. The depression still gripped millions of families. Few wanted to imagine American sons marching to fight for a faraway African kingdom. The Neutrality Acts ensured that the United States would not intervene. The fall of Ethiopia was more than a colonial war. It was a signal. A dictator had defied the international system, and instead of punishment, he had won glory. Rome staged victory parades. Mussolini's popularity soared. Fascist propaganda hailed him as the heir of Caesar. But beneath the triumphalism lay a dangerous precedent. The world had blinked. Aggression had paid. The warning of Haile Selassie, "It will be you tomorrow," was about to come true. What if a single nation became the testing ground for the weapons, tactics, and ideologies that would soon ignite the world? In Spain, between 1936 and 1000, 939 civil war erupted, and the struggle became far more than a domestic conflict. It was fascism versus democracy, communism versus conservatism, modern warfare against the old. Spain's agony foreshadowed the global storm to come. Spain in the 1932nd was a nation divided. Centuries of monarchy and aristocracy had left deep inequalities. Landowners held vast estates while peasants worked in poverty. The church wielded immense power. Industrial workers in cities like Barcelona demanded rights and reforms. In 1931, the monarchy was overthrown and a republic declared. The new government introduced progressive policies, land redistribution, secular schools, women's suffrage. But these reforms angered conservatives, the church, and the military. By 1936, political tensions exploded. That summer, General Francisco Franco and other officers launched a military coup against the Republican government. The country split overnight. The Republicans, also called Loyalists, included socialists, communists, anarchists, and liberals. They were joined by workers' militias and farmers defending reform. On the other side, Franco's nationalists drew support from monarchists, conservatives, the Catholic hierarchy, and the military elite. What began as an internal revolt quickly turned into an international struggle. Hitler and Mussolini saw opportunity. Both feared communism and saw Spain as a chance to expand influence and test weapons. Germany sent the Condor Legion, a unit of pilots, tanks, and advisors. Italy dispatched tens of thousands of troops and aircraft. For Hitler, Spain was also a laboratory. German pilots practiced dive bombing tactics, which would later terrorize Poland and France. German tanks learned coordination with infantry and air power. Mussolini used the conflict to showcase fascist solidarity. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, came to the aid of the Republican. Joseph Stalin supplied weapon, tank, and aircraft, though often outdated. He also sent military advisors and encouraged communist control within the Republican side. Leftist volunteers from around the world poured into Spain, forming the international brigades. Idealists from America, Britain, France, and other countries believed they were defending democracy against fascism. Among them were the Abraham Lincoln Brigade American volunteers who fought in bloody battles on Spanish soil. Writers like George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway witnessed the war firsthand, leaving powerful accounts. The fighting was brutal and modern. In April 1937, the Basque town of Guernica was bombed by German aircraft in coordination with Franco's forces. Civilians were massacred. Buildings burned for days. The attack shocked the world. Pablo Picasso immortalized the horror in his painting Guernica, a stark depiction of suffering. It became an enduring symbol of civilian terror in modern war. Despite international sympathy, the Republicans were hampered by disunity. Anarchists and communists clashed over control. Resources were scarce. The Western democracies, Britain, France, and the United States, adopted a policy of non-intervention, hoping to avoid escalation. In practice, this meant the Republicans faced isolation while Franco received steady support from Hitler and Mussolini. Battle by battle, the nationalists advanced. Madrid held out under siege for years, but the weight of superior firepower wore down Republican forces. By 1938, the Republic was collapsing. In March 1939, Madrid fell. Franco declared victory. The war had killed an estimated 500,000 people, left cities in ruins, and driven thousands into exile. The consequences reached far beyond Spain's borders. Franco established a fascist dictatorship that would last until his death in 1975. Hitler and Mussolini emerged confident. Their forces had gained invaluable combat experience. Their weapons had proven devastating. Their gamble had paid off. No major power had dared to stop them. For the democracies, the lesson was grim. Appeasement and neutrality had failed, even in the face of clear aggression. For the world, Spain was not just a tragedy but a warning. The bombers over Guernica foreshadowed the Blitz over London. The tank assaults in the Spanish countryside previewed blitzkrieg in Poland. The indifference of the democracies signaled to Hitler that the West lacked resolve. Spain's war ended in 1939, the same year the World War began. To many who fought and died in Spain, the struggle felt like the opening act of a larger, darker play. And they were right. The rehearsal was over. The main stage awaited. What if the moment to stop a dictator came not on a battlefield but on a quiet stretch of river valley, and no one acted? In March 1936, Adolf Hitler made his riskiest gamble yet, sending German troops into the Rhineland. If France had responded with force, his entire regime might have collapsed. Instead, the world hesitated and Hitler's confidence soared. The Rhineland, a fertile industrial strip along the Rhine River, had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. France, sharing its border, demanded the buffer as protection against future German aggression. For nearly 2 decades, no German soldier could legally set foot there. But Hitler believed Versailles was a chain choking Germany's destiny. He had already defied restrictions by building tanks and planes. Now, with Mussolini distracted by Ethiopia and Britain hesitant, he seized his chance. On the 7th of March 1936, 22000, German soldiers marched into the Rhineland. Their orders were clear. If France resisted militarily, they must retreat at once. The German army was still too weak for war. Yet no French troops came. The French government, divided and fearful, refused to act without British support. In London, many leaders viewed Hitler's move as Germans simply entering their own backyard. Within days, German forces dug in. The gamble had succeeded. For Hitler, the victory was intoxicating. His popularity at home soared. Crowds cheered the defiance of Versailles. Generals who had doubted him now hailed his courage. More importantly, he had learned a critical lesson: the Western powers lacked the will to fight. 2 years later, he struck again, this time at Austria. The idea of uniting all German-speaking peoples under one Reich, the Anschluss, had long been a goal. Austria, a small republic since the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, was politically unstable. Its government wavered between authoritarianism and democracy, while factions battled in the street. Many Austrians admired Hitler's success in restoring German pride. Nazi sympathizers within Austria plotted to bring the two countries together. In early 1938, Hitler increased pressure. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, desperate to preserve independence, announced a national referendum on whether Austria should remain free. Hitler could not risk defeat at the polls. On the 12th of March, German troops crossed the border. They met no resistance. In Vienna, jubilant crowds greeted them with flowers and salutes. 2 days later, Austria was formally annexed into the German Reich. The Anschluss was complete. Again, the world protested but did not act. Britain and France issued diplomatic notes, but no sanctions or military move followed. Many outside Germany accepted Hitler's claim that Austrians welcomed unification. Yet the reality was darker. Political opponents were arrested. Jews were humiliated and attacked in the streets. And Austria's independence vanished overnight. For Hitler, the annexation was another triumph. Germany now controlled Austria's resources, manpower, and strategic position. The move also opened the path to Czechoslovakia, with its vulnerable borders and German-speaking Sudetenland. Each conquest emboldened him further, proving that aggression brought reward without consequence. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Nazi propaganda celebrated unity. Films, rallies, and speeches glorified the new Greater Germany. Children were taught that borders set by Versailles were unjust lines waiting to be erased. Hitler's personal prestige reached new heights. To many Germans, it seemed he could do no wrong. But to the outside world, warning signs multiplied. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and France's leaders still clung to appeasement, hoping concessions would satisfy Hitler's ambitions. They underestimated him. Far from being satisfied, he was preparing the next demand, one that would soon plunge Europe into crisis. The role of the historical script writing assistant is to ensure plain text output exactly 5000 characters, excluding spaces, no titles, no sound cues, no YouTube policy violation, optimized for 11 Labs Voice US. Cohn maintain. What if the price of peace was paid with someone else's freedom? In 1938, the world gathered in Munich to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. No bombs fell, no armies clashed, but the choices made in those gilded conference halls paved the road to war. Czechoslovakia was one of the most successful democracies born from the ashes of World War I. Its cities thrived with industry, its borders guarded by a strong army and defensive fortifications along the Sudetenland, a mountainous region bordering Germany. But the Sudetenland also contained 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were oppressed by the Czech government and demanded their liberation. In truth, the Sudetenland was strategically vital. Its fortresses and factories were the backbone of Czechoslovakia's defense. Without it, the nation would be vulnerable. Hitler's demand was not about minority rights, it was about conquest. Through 1,938 tensions mounted, Hitler escalated speeches declaring that Germans in the Sudetenland must be united with the Reich. Nazi-backed groups inside Czechoslovakia staged unrest. War loomed. The Czech government prepared to fight, mobilizing its well-trained army, but its survival depended on allies. France had pledged support in case of attack. Britain, too, was tied to European stability. Yet both governments dreaded war. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet Hitler. Chamberlain hoped personal diplomacy could preserve peace. Hitler at first promised he wanted no more than Sudetenland, but his tone grew harsher. He threatened war unless his demands were met. Chamberlain returned home, shaken, but convinced compromise was possible. The crisis climaxed at Munich on the 29th of September, 1938. Leaders of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France met in Hitler's presence. Notably absent was Czechoslovakia itself. No Czech representatives were allowed at the table where their nation's fate was sealed. Inside the conference rooms, Hitler ranted about German grievances. Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier, desperate to avoid another world war, gave in. They agreed that Germany could annex the Sudetenland. In return, Hitler pledged he had no further territorial ambitions. The agreement was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy. Chamberlain returned to London holding the signed paper and declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." Crowds cheered. Newspapers applauded. For a brief moment it seemed Europe had been spared war. But in Prague, despair reigned. Czechoslovakia had not been consulted, only betrayed. Its fortified defenses, painstakingly built against German aggression, were handed over. Its strongest industries were lost. Its allies had abandoned it in the name of appeasement. Hitler wasted no time. In October 1938, German troops marched into the Sudetenland. Local Nazis celebrated, while Czech families fled. Hitler, exultant, declared victory without firing a shot. Yet his promises were empty. Just months later, in March 1939, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The pretense of defending ethnic Germans was gone. The Reich had simply swallowed a sovereign state. The betrayal sent shockwaves through Europe. Even Chamberlain, once convinced of Hitler's honesty, realized appeasement had failed. Britain and France now promised to defend Poland if Hitler struck there, but the damage was done. Hitler had grown bold, convinced his enemies were weak. Czechoslovakia was gone, its independence erased. For ordinary Czechs, the occupation brought fear. Political opponents were arrested. Jews faced immediate persecution. Factories were harnessed for German rearmament. Resistance movements began, but the price for defiance was harsh. Yet the spirit of betrayal lingered strongest. Many remembered that their nation had been sacrificed not by enemies but by supposed allies. In Berlin, the lesson for Hitler was clear. The West lacked resolve. Concessions would not quench his appetite, they would only whet it. Munich had not prevented war. It had only delayed it while making Germany stronger. For the world, the illusion of peace would last less than a year. Soon, Hitler's next move would shatter it completely. What if the two bitterest enemies of ideology, the Nazis and the Communists, shook hands in secret? In August 1939, the world watched in disbelief as Germany and the Soviet Union's sworn adversaries signed a pact of friendship. Days later, Hitler's armies rolled into Poland, and the world plunged into war. Throughout the summer of 1939, Europe teetered on the edge. Hitler had already taken Austria and Czechoslovakia without serious resistance. His next target was Poland. The Polish corridor and the city of Danzig, cut off from Germany by Versailles, were declared essential to the Reich. Hitler demanded concessions. Poland refused, relying on promises of aid from Britain and France. War seemed inevitable. Yet Hitler feared one thing, a two-front war. If Germany invaded Poland, could the Soviet Union strike from the east? Behind closed doors, his diplomats approached Moscow. To the shock of the world, Joseph Stalin listened. For years, Nazi propaganda had denounced communism as Germany's mortal enemy. Now pragmatism outweighed ideology. Stalin distrusted Britain and France, believing they wanted Hitler to turn east and bleed Russia. By dealing with Hitler directly, he could buy time, gain territory, and strengthen his position. On the 23rd of August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Officially, it was a non-aggression treaty between Germany and the USSR. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be carved in two. The Baltic states would fall to Moscow. Hitler had secured his eastern flank. Stalin had gained breathing room and land. The world was stunned. How could fascists and communists embrace? But for both dictators, the pact was ruthless calculation. Just a week later, at dawn, on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler unleashed blitzkrieg lightning war. German planes roared across Polish skies, bombing railways, bridges, and cities. Tanks spearheaded thrusts deep into enemy lines, cutting communications and surrounding units. The speed and coordination were unprecedented. Polish defenses crumbled. Civilians fled in panic as the Luftwaffe strafed roads. Warsaw endured relentless bombing. Within days, German armies had penetrated hundreds of miles. Britain and France, bound by their pledges, declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September. Crowds in London and Paris gathered in stunned silence as radio broadcasts announced the return of a nightmare. Yet their armies did not march. No immediate aid reached Poland. The Western Allies hesitated, unwilling to launch a major offensive. For Poland, isolation was fatal. On the 1st of September 7, Stalin Street rock. Soviet troops crossed Poland's eastern border, claiming to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. In reality, they fulfilled the secret pact. Poland, attacked from both sides, stood no chance. Its government fled into exile. By early October, resistance was crushed. Hitler and Stalin divided the spoils. For Poland's people, the conquest was catastrophic. In the German zone, Jews were herded into ghettos. Intellectuals, priests, and political leaders were executed. In the Soviet zone, thousands were deported to Siberia. The Katyn massacre, in which Soviet forces executed Polish officers, symbolized the brutality to come. The country vanished from the map, carved apart by two dictators who claimed to be enemies but acted as partners. For Hitler, the campaign was a triumph. Blitzkrieg had worked flawlessly. The Wehrmacht had proven itself unstoppable. At home, Germans celebrated another swift victory. Hitler exulted that he had outwitted Britain and France yet again. But the war he had unleashed would not remain confined to Poland. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation with grim resolve. Britain was now at war with Germany. In Paris, similar declarations echoed. The Allies had drawn a line at last. Yet in the opening months, little action followed. While Poland bled, the West stood mostly still. The invasion of Poland marked more than the outbreak of another European conflict. It was the beginning of a world war. The pact between Hitler and Stalin had stunned the globe, proving that ideology mattered less than ambition. Poland's destruction was a warning of the brutality ahead. Modern mechanized war, swift, ruthless, and total. And even as the ruins of Warsaw smoldered, Hitler's eyes were already shifting westward. What if war was declared, but the battlefields remained eerily quiet? After the conquest of Poland in September 1939, Europe braced for carnage. Britain and France had declared war on Germany. Citizens dug trenches, donned gas masks, and waited for bombs. Yet for months the Western Front lay silent. Newspapers called it the phony war, a strange pause that was calm only on the surface. In Britain, memories of the Great War haunted the nation. Cities prepared for massive air raids. Children were evacuated from London to the countryside, clutching gas masks and ration books. Blackout curtains sealed windows at night. Sirens wailed during drills. Yet no bombs fell on London in 1939. The Luftwaffe stayed quiet. In France, soldiers manned the Maginot Line, a fortress system stretching along the German border. Deep underground bunkers with artillery barracks and tunnels seemed impregnable. The French army, confident in its defenses, waited behind walls. Across the frontier, German soldiers waited too. The world's mightiest armies glared at each other across barbed wire, but neither moved. The war, however, was real elsewhere. At sea, the German Navy struck. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hunting merchant ships, carrying supplies to Britain. Convoys became lifelines. In September 1939, the British passenger liner, Athenia, was torpedoed, killing more than 100 civilians, including Americans. Outrage spread across the Atlantic. The Royal Navy scrambled to protect shipping, but the submarines were relentless. By winter, dozens of ships had been sunk. The surface fleet also scored dramatic blows. The German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee roamed the South Atlantic, sinking Allied freighters. In December 1939, British cruisers cornered her near Uruguay in the Battle of the River Plate. Damaged and low on supplies, the captain scuttled his ship rather than fight. The spectacle drew international attention, showing both the danger of German raiders and the reach of British naval power. Germany also unveiled new weapons. Magnetic mines dropped from aircraft into coastal waters, detonated beneath unsuspecting ships. Merchant vessels exploded without warning. British engineers raced to develop countermeasures, risking their lives to defuse live mines and discover how they worked. Slowly, they devised sweeping devices to clear harbors, but the danger remained constant. On land, small clashes broke out. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland after demanding territory. The winter war that followed shocked observers. Outnumbered Finns, dressed in white camouflage, fought with ferocity snowbound forests, ambushing Soviet tanks with Molotov cocktails. The world admired Finland's courage, but no help arrived. By March 1940, the Finns were forced to cede land. The campaign exposed Soviet weaknesses, but it also expanded Stalin's reach. Back in the West, the months of waiting created a surreal atmosphere. British newspapers printed cartoons of soldiers bored in trenches, joking that they were fighting the sit-down war. French soldiers played cards, wrote letters, and endured winter cold in bunkers. Civilians grew restless under rationing and blackouts with no real battles. Some wondered if the war would fade without another clash. But beneath the calm, Germany was preparing. Hitler knew his economy could not withstand a long stalemate. He planned to strike west in spring 1940. The pause was not peace, it was a countdown. German generals studied routes through Belgium and the Ardennes. Panzer divisions drilled relentlessly. Luftwaffe squadrons stockpiled fuel and bombs. The calm of the phony war was the silence before the storm. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain clung to cautious optimism. He believed time was on the Allies' side, that German weakness would surface. Winston Churchill, newly returned to government as First Lord of the Admiralty, warned otherwise. He studied U-boat losses and naval battles, convinced the real fight was only beginning. His speeches urged vigilance. For ordinary Europeans, daily life during the phony war was filled with uncertainty. Families carried gas masks on commutes. Posters urged citizens to dig for victory by planting gardens. In France, refugees from Poland and Czechoslovakia told stories of German brutality, but many dismissed them as exaggerations. Few wanted to imagine that Paris, Brussels, or London could suffer the same fate as Warsaw. The phony war gave democracies a false sense of safety, while giving Germany priceless time. By spring, the lull would end with a sudden rush of tanks, planes, and fire. The storm was coming. What if the fate of the North Atlantic hinged on frozen fjords and icy ports? In the spring of 1940, the quiet phony war ended, not in France or Belgium, but in Scandinavia. Hitler struck at Norway and Denmark, and with breathtaking speed, Germany secured vital territory that would shape the course of the war at sea. For months, Scandinavia had seemed distant from the European crisis. Denmark was a small kingdom, neutral and peaceful. Norway, with its dramatic mountains and fjords, guarded key shipping lanes. Yet both countries mattered more than they appeared. Sweden exported vast quantities of iron ore essential for German steel production. In winter, much of that ore reached Germany through the Norwegian port of Narvik. If Britain could cut off that route, Germany's war machine might falter. In London, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, urged bold action. He proposed mining Norwegian waters to block shipments. Others hesitated, fearing to violate Norwegian neutrality, but Hitler had already decided that Germany could not risk losing access to Scandinavian iron. He planned Operation Weserübung, the simultaneous invasion of Denmark and Norway. On the 9th of April 1940, the German assault began. In Denmark, it was over in hours. German troops crossed the border at dawn, while paratroopers seized key bridges and airfields. Faced with overwhelming force and threats of bombing Copenhagen, the Danish government surrendered the same day. Denmark would endure a relatively lenient occupation, but its fall shocked the world with its speed. Norway proved a greater challenge. German warships carried troops into Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. Paratroopers, a weapon still new to modern war, descended from the skies to seize airfields. Norwegian defenses were brave but scattered. In Oslo, heavy coastal guns at the fortress of Oscarsborg sank the cruiser Blücher, delaying the capture of the capital. King Haakon VII refused to surrender. His defiance made him a symbol of resistance, even as German troops advanced. The Allies scrambled to respond. British and French forces landed at Narvik and other northern ports, hoping to cut the iron ore line and rally Norwegian defenders. Fierce battles raged in snow-covered mountains. Norwegian troops, supported by Allied soldiers, retook Narvik temporarily. The Royal Navy fought German destroyers in narrow fjords, sinking many, but suffering losses as well. But events elsewhere doomed the campaign. In May 1940, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The Allies, facing catastrophe, at home withdrew from Norway to defend their own soil. By early June, Norway capitulated. Its king and government escaped to Britain, forming a government in exile. Germany now controlled the entire Norwegian coast. Strategically, the victory was immense for Hitler. From Norway, German U-boats and aircraft could strike deep into the North Atlantic, threatening Britain's vital convoys. The ports gave safe harbor to surface raiders like the battleship Tirpitz. The occupation tied down Allied resources and secured iron ore shipments. For Britain, the campaign was a bitter lesson. Hesitation and divided priorities had cost dearly. The political consequences were just as dramatic. In London, anger over the failed Norwegian campaign forced Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to resign. Winston Churchill replaced him as Prime Minister, a change that would define the war's future. His rise to leadership came not through triumph, but through failure forged in crisis. For Norwegians and Danes, life under occupation began. In Denmark, cooperation with German authorities allowed relative calm, though underground resistance grew. In Norway, resistance fighters organized sabotage missions aided by the British. Civilians endured rationing arrests and Nazi repression. Quisling, a Norwegian collaborator, gave his name to treachery itself. The Scandinavian campaign proved that Germany could strike anywhere swiftly and ruthlessly. It also showed the Allies' weakness in coordination and resolve. Hitler's armies now stood at the edge of the North Sea, poised to strike at Western Europe. The lull of the phony war was over. The lightning storm of Blitzkrieg was about to descend on France. What if the strongest army in Europe collapsed in just weeks because its leaders prepared for the wrong war? In May 1940, Germany launched its invasion of France, and with breathtaking speed, the Wehrmacht pierced defenses once thought unassailable. The lightning strike through the Ardennes forest shocked the world, ending the illusion that World War II might resemble the slow stalemate of World War I. For months, Allied strategy had been shaped by memories of the last war. The French army, though large, relied heavily on the Maginot Line, an immense chain of fortresses, bunkers and artillery stretching along the German border. Deep underground, it seemed impregnable. French generals believed no enemy could breach it. They expected any German attack would come through Belgium, as in 1914. Accordingly, they prepared the Dial Plan. When Germany moved, French and British armies would rush into Belgium, meet the attack, and stop it there. Hitler's generals, however, devised something different. General Erich von Manstein proposed striking not where the Allies expected, but where they thought impossible, the Ardennes, a forested hilly region along the Belgian-Luxembourg border. French High Command dismissed the area as unsuitable for tanks. Roads were narrow bridges, scarce terrain, rough. But German panzer commanders were willing to gamble. They believed speed and surprise would outweigh difficulty. On the 10th of May 1940, the offensive began. German forces swept into the Netherlands and northern Belgium with paratroopers and tanks. The Allies rushed forward to meet them, believing this was the main thrust. It was a feint. The real hammer fell further south. Columns of German panzers, more than 1500 tanks, pushed through the Ardennes. Engineers built pontoon bridges across rivers under fire. Luftwaffe bombers blasted roads and railways to block reinforcements. French units guarding the forest were thin, ill-equipped, and quickly overwhelmed. Within days, armored spearheads broke through near Sedan. The supposedly impassable forest had become a highway for invasion. On May 13, German forces stormed across the Meuse River at Sedan. Stuka dive bombers screamed down on French positions, shattering morale with their howling sirens and relentless strikes. Infantry followed, seizing crossings. French defenders, outgunned and stunned by the ferocity of air power, collapsed. Tanks rolled over improvised barricades. By May 15, the breakthrough was complete. The German advance was astonishing in speed. Tanks raced westward, cutting through northern France. Motorized infantry followed, while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The Allies, caught off balance, scrambled to respond. French commanders, bound by rigid doctrines and slow communications, could not adapt. Units ordered to counterattack found themselves surrounded before they could move. Meanwhile, in Belgium, French and British forces fought bravely, unaware they were being outflanked. The German feint there tied down the strongest Allied armies. By the time commanders realized the true threat lay at Sedan, German spearheads were already driving toward the English Channel. In Paris, panic spread. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned Winston Churchill in London, "We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill urged him to resist, but the truth was grim. French morale cracked as reports of German tanks deep inside their territory poured in. Refugees clogged roads fleeing west with carts, bicycles, and whatever belongings they could carry, while German bombers strafed highways packed with civilians. For the Wehrmacht, the operation was a triumph of modern warfare. Coordination between air armor and mechanized infantry achieved what World War I generals had never managed: a decisive breakthrough. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a revolution in war. The Ardennes breakthrough changed everything. It trapped the Allied armies advancing into Belgium, cutting them off from the south. The British Expeditionary Force, along with hundreds of thousands of French troops, now faced encirclement. Their only hope would be evacuation. The fall of France had begun not over months or years, but in mere days. The strongest defenses had crumbled, the proud French army staggered, and the road to Paris lay open. The world, watching in disbelief, realized that the storm unleashed in Poland was now sweeping across Western Europe with unstoppable force. What if the fate of an entire war depended on fishing boats, ferries, and pleasure yachts crossing a narrow channel under fire? In late May 1940, the German Blitzkrieg had cut through France with stunning speed. The Allied armies, British, French, and Belgian, were encircled along the northern coast. Their only hope lay at the port of Dunkirk, and their survival would shape the rest of the conflict. After the breakthrough at Sedan, German panzer divisions raced westward, reaching the English Channel at Abbeville on May 20. The maneuver cut off nearly 4,000 Allied troops in Belgium and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force, commanded by Lord Galt, was trapped with no escape route except the sea. To the south, the rest of France struggled to reorganize, but German momentum seemed unstoppable. Adolf Hitler's generals urged him to finish the job with a massive armored strike into Dunkirk. Yet, in one of history's most debated decisions, Hitler ordered a temporary halt. The reasons remain controversial. Concerns about overextended tanks, swampy terrain, and Luftwaffe promises to destroy the pocket from the air. The pause gave the Allies a brief, priceless window. Operation Dynamo was born. On May 26, the British Admiralty launched a desperate evacuation plan from Dunkirk. Royal Navy destroyers, merchant ships, fishing boats, and ferries were called into service. Even civilian pleasure yachts joined the Armada. Some were commandeered, others sailed voluntarily. The call went out across southern England, and within days, hundreds of little ships crossed the Channel. At Dunkirk, the situation was dire. German artillery shelled the beaches. Luftwaffe bombers swept overhead, dropping bombs on ships and men alike. Fires consumed oil tanks in the harbor. Yet British and French soldiers, disciplined despite chaos, formed lines along the sand, waiting for rescue. They waded into the shallow surf rifles slung across their shoulders as small boats ferried them to larger ships offshore. Civilians who had never seen combat suddenly found themselves steering through smoke, machine gun fire, and wreckage to pull strangers to safety. The evacuation lasted 9 days, from May 26 to the 4th of June. Conditions were harrowing. Destroyers and troopships were sunk by bombs and torpedoes. Soldiers drowned when overloaded boats capsized. Yet, against all odds, the operation succeeded beyond expectation. By the time it ended, more than 338,000 soldiers, British, French, and Belgian, had been rescued. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. Heavy equipment, tanks, and artillery were abandoned. France was still collapsing. But the preservation of the British Expeditionary Force was a miracle of endurance and resolve. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, called it a colossal military disaster, but also a deliverance. In his speech to Parliament, he declared that wars are not won by evacuations, but in the same breath, he promised Britain would fight on the beaches, fight on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and in the streets. His words steeled a nation bracing for invasion. For the French, Dunkirk was bittersweet. Many of their troops fought bravely to hold the perimeter, buying time for evacuation, only to be captured when the last boats departed. France itself was still under assault, and its fate would soon be sealed. But their sacrifice ensured that Britain would not stand alone without an army. German commanders, though frustrated by the escape, still viewed the campaign as a triumph. France remained at their mercy. Yet, the failure to annihilate the British army proved critical. The men saved at Dunkirk would fight again in North Africa, in Italy, and on D-Day. The miracle of Dunkirk became a rallying cry, proof that even in retreat there was hope. For civilians across Europe, the sight of fishing boats and yachts plucking soldiers from the sea symbolized resilience. The people of Britain had thrown their weight into the struggle, not only through speeches or industry, but with their very hands. A war that seemed lost now carried a glimmer of defiance. Still, Dunkirk did not end the German onslaught. Even as exhausted men reached English shores, Hitler prepared his next move. France itself would soon fall, and Britain would face the storm alone. What if the proudest army of Europe, thought to be the strongest after the Great War, collapsed in just 6 weeks? In June 1940, the German Blitzkrieg achieved what had seemed impossible. France, a great power, was crushed and occupied. The shock reverberated worldwide, convincing many that Hitler's Reich was unstoppable. After Dunkirk, France still fielded large forces. Nearly 2 million French soldiers remained supported by British reinforcements, but their morale was shaken. Refugees clogged the roads, millions fleeing advancing German columns. Families with carts and bicycles struggled beside retreating soldiers. German aircraft strafed highways, turning the exodus into carnage. The collapse of order spread fear faster than tanks. On the 5th of June, Hitler launched Vorrot, the second phase of the invasion. German divisions surged south from the Somme. The French army, disorganized and exhausted, could not regroup. German panzers bypassed strongpoints, cut communication lines, and encircled defenders. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing bridges and railways. Resistance crumbled. By the 10th of June, the French government abandoned Paris, declaring it an open city to avoid destruction. The capital, rich with centuries of history and culture, lay vulnerable. On the 14th of June, German troops marched into Paris, unopposed. Crowds watched in silence as swastika flags unfurled on public buildings. At the Eiffel Tower, German soldiers posed for photographs. Nazi propaganda filmed the spectacle, portraying Hitler as master of Europe. The fall of Paris stunned the world. The city that had resisted siege in 1870 and celebrated victory in 1918 surrendered without a fight. To many, it seemed civilization itself was under assault. German officers dined in Parisian cafes, while Parisians endured rationing, curfews, and fear. Behind the facade of order, arrests and persecution began. Jews, political opponents, and suspected resistors were targeted immediately. In the forests of Compiègne, the site where Germany had signed its humiliating armistice in 1918, Hitler staged his revenge. On the 22nd of June 1940, France officially surrendered in the same railway carriage. Hitler sat triumphantly in the very seat once occupied by Marshal Foch. For him it was poetic justice. For France it was humiliation. The terms divided the nation. Northern and western France, including Paris, came under direct German occupation. The remainder, centered in the spa town of Vichy, became a collaborationist regime under Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun in World War I. Vichy France pledged to work with Germany, maintaining a facade of sovereignty while bowing to Nazi demands. Many French citizens saw Pétain as a protector, others as a traitor. For those unwilling to accept surrender, resistance began. Some fled south, others abroad. General Charles de Gaulle, a little-known officer, escaped to London. On the 18th of June, he broadcast a call to arms over the BBC, urging French soldiers and citizens to continue the fight. Few heard it at the time, but his words planted seeds of defiance that would grow into the Free French movement. In Britain, the fall of France was a catastrophe. The Royal Navy rescued as many troops as possible, but much equipment was lost. Britain now stood alone in Western Europe. Across the Atlantic, Americans watched anxiously. Many still hoped to avoid involvement, but the rapid collapse of France suggested that isolation might not shield them forever. For Hitler, victory was total. In less than 2 months, his armies had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. His gamble on blitzkrieg had shattered the old balance of power. Europe lay at his feet. Even his generals were astonished at the scale of success. Yet beneath triumph lay challenges. Britain refused to surrender, and Hitler's plans now turned across the Channel. But for the moment, the conquest of France marked the height of his power. The swastika flew over Paris. German troops paraded down the Champs-Élysées. And a continent that had once believed in peace through appeasement now saw the cost of hesitation. What if the survival of democracy rested not on armies or navies, but on a few thousand pilots in the skies above England? In the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze across the Channel. Britain stood alone. To conquer it, he needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. The result was the Battle of Britain, the first great air campaign in history, and a struggle that would decide the fate of Europe. With France defeated, Germany controlled the coasts of Western Europe from Norway to Spain. Hitler hoped Britain would sue for peace. Winston Churchill, however, rejected any negotiation. In his defiant speeches, he vowed that Britain would never surrender. Hitler then ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But invasion required air superiority. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, was tasked with crushing the RAF. The battle began in July 1940. At first, German bombers targeted shipping convoys in the Channel and radar stations along the coast. Then came massive assaults on airfields and aircraft factories. Day after day, waves of Messerschmitt fighters and Heinkel and Dornier bombers crossed the Channel. The RAF scrambled Hurricanes and Spitfires to intercept. Dogfights erupted high above fields and villages, twisting contrails marking deadly duels. British pilots flew multiple sorties a day, often outnumbered. Many were barely out of training. They returned to bases bombed and cratered, reloaded and took off again. Their endurance amazed the world. Radar, a new technology, gave them a crucial edge, allowing controllers to direct squadrons where attacks were coming. Ground observers scanned skies with binoculars. Every resource was bent to the struggle. In August, the battle reached its peak. On the 13th of August, the Luftwaffe launched Adlertag, Eagle Day, a massive offensive. Hundreds of bombers filled the sky. For weeks, the RAF fought desperately. Losses mounted on both sides. Many believed Britain could not hold much longer. Yet the Luftwaffe made a critical mistake. Frustrated by RAF resistance, Hitler shifted strategy. Instead of continuing to pound airfields, German bombers targeted London and other cities. The Blitz began. On the 7th of September 1940, nearly 1000 aircraft attacked London. Docks, factories and neighborhoods burned. Civilians took shelter in underground stations, huddled on platforms as bombs thundered overhead. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. Fire brigades worked through the night. Casualties soared. Over the next 8 months, German raids struck London nightly, as well as Coventry, Liverpool and other cities. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Yet the change in strategy gave the RAF breathing space. Airfields were repaired, pilots recovered, and production of new fighters increased. The RAF endured. On the 15th of September, a massive German raid was repelled with heavy losses, forcing Göring to scale back attacks. By October, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was abandoned. For Britain, survival was victory. Churchill praised the RAF's young pilots with words that echoed through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The few, as they became known, represented more than military skill. They symbolized courage against overwhelming odds. For ordinary Britons, the Blitz became a test of endurance. Families slept in shelters, emerging to find homes, destroyed but spirits unbroken. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Newspapers carried photos of Londoners reading morning papers amid bombed-out streets defying despair. Propaganda posters urged calm and unity. The phrase, "keep calm and carry on," printed though rarely distributed, captured the national mood. The Battle of Britain marked Hitler's first major defeat. It showed that air power alone could not conquer a determined nation. It kept Britain in the war, providing a base for future Allied offensives. Without Britain, there would have been no D-Day, no staging ground for liberation. But survival came at a price. Cities lay in ruins, civilians lived under constant threat, and even as the bombs fell, Hitler began planning his next great gamble, an invasion not across the Channel, but deep into the Soviet Union. What if the survival of freedom rested on one island, battered from the air, strangled at sea, and standing utterly alone from the summer of 1940 through the spring of 1941, Britain endured its darkest hours. France had fallen. Hitler's armies dominated Europe. The Soviet Union was bound by pact to Germany. The United States remained neutral. Against this backdrop, Britain fought on, sustained by defiance, empire, and endurance. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May 1940, provided unshakable leadership. His speeches resonated far beyond Parliament. On radio broadcasts, his gravelly voice promised no surrender. He offered not comfort but courage, telling Britons he had nothing to give but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. His words became a weapon as vital as guns. He toured bombed neighborhoods, cigar in hand, hat lifted in salute, embodying resilience. Meanwhile, the Blitz continued. From September 1940 to May 1941, German bombers hammered London and other cities night after night. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Coventry, an industrial center, was devastated in a single raid, its cathedral left in ruins. More than 4,000 civilians were killed, many more injured. Yet morale did not collapse. Families crowded into air raid shelters or underground tunnels. Children played games, while explosions shook the walls. In the morning, Londoners swept glass from the streets and returned to work. Outside the cities, the countryside became a fortress. Anti-aircraft guns bristled in fields. Searchlights pierced the night sky. Barrage balloons floated above towns to deter low-flying bombers. The Home Guard men too old or too young, for the regular army trained with broomsticks and shotguns, ready to repel invasion. Posters urged citizens to dig for victory, turning gardens into vegetable plots. Housewives queued for ration food, making do with limited supplies. Life was harsh, but determination held. Britain did not stand entirely alone. Across the empire, resources and troops flowed in. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and colonies from India to the Caribbean pledged support. Canadian pilots flew in the RAF. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa. Merchant ships from across the globe brought food and fuel, though many were lost to U-boats. The empire, often taken for granted, before the war became Britain's lifeline. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic raged. German submarines hunted convoys, sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Churchill later admitted, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. To counter it, Britain developed convoy systems, improved sonar, and worked with Canadian escorts. The fight for supply lines would last years, but in 1940-41, the threat was dire." Churchill also sought allies. He knew Britain could not win alone. His eyes turned to Washington. President Franklin Roosevelt sympathized, but faced strong isolationist sentiment at home. Still, he found ways to aid Britain. In September 1940, the Destroyers for Bases deal provided Britain with 50 aging U.S. destroyers in exchange for leases on Atlantic bases. It was not yet full alliance, but it signaled growing cooperation. In these months, invasion seemed a real danger. German troops massed on the French coast. Operation Sea Lion remained on Hitler's table, though without air superiority it was never attempted. Still, Britain braced for the worst. Beaches were fortified with barbed wire pillboxes and mines. School children were drilled in evacuation plans. The nation lived with the constant shadow of invasion, yet defiance prevailed. Culturally, the struggle inspired unity. Songs like "We'll Meet Again" comforted civilians. The image of St. Paul's Cathedral, rising unbroken above London's flames, became a symbol of endurance. Writers and journalists captured the spirit of resistance, sending reports across the Atlantic that swayed American opinion. The narrative of Britain alone stirred admiration worldwide. By the spring of 1941, Britain had survived a year no one believed possible. The Blitz slackened as Hitler turned east toward the Soviet Union. The threat of invasion receded. Britain remained scarred but unbroken. It was not victory but survival, and in survival lay hope. The world saw that Hitler could be resisted. Britain's endurance ensured that the war would continue, that freedom still had a stronghold, and that eventually allies would join. The darkest hour had not destroyed the island. Instead, it forged its resolve. What if the arsenal of democracy armed the fight for freedom long before America's soldiers entered the battlefield? Between 1940 and 1941, the United States remained officially neutral, yet President Franklin Roosevelt pushed his nation ever closer to involvement. His careful maneuvering, balancing public opinion with urgent necessity, gave Britain the tools to survive while reshaping the global struggle. In 1940, American opinion remained deeply divided. Memories of World War I still lingered. Many families remembered sons lost in the trenches. The Depression, though easing, had left scars. Isolationists argued that Europe's wars were not America's concern. Organizations like the America First Committee, supported by figures such as aviator Charles Lindbergh, demanded strict neutrality. They warned against entangling alliances and claimed the Atlantic Ocean would shield the United States. Roosevelt, however, saw the danger clearly. The fall of France in June 1940 convinced him that Britain was now the last barrier between Hitler and domination of Europe. If Britain fell, the Axis might control the Atlantic, threatening the Western Hemisphere itself. Roosevelt believed aiding Britain was essential, not only for moral reasons, but for America's own security. Yet he knew Congress and public opinion would not support direct entry into war. He needed creative solutions. The first step came in September 1940 with the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The United States transferred 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. The deal strengthened Britain's naval defense and extended America's strategic reach. Roosevelt framed it not as intervention, but as prudent defense. That same year, Roosevelt sought an unprecedented third term as president. His opponent, Republican Wendell Willkie, also supported aid to Britain, though he criticized Roosevelt's methods. The election became a referendum on Roosevelt's leadership. He won decisively, giving him the mandate to expand assistance. By late 1940, Britain's financial reserves were collapsing. Paying cash for weapons and supplies was no longer possible. Churchill warned Roosevelt that Britain could not continue without support. Roosevelt responded with a bold proposal, the Lend-Lease Act, announced in December 1940 and passed by Congress in March 1941. It authorized the President to lend or lease arms, munitions, and supplies to any nation vital to U.S. security. Roosevelt explained it with a homely analogy. If a neighbor's house is on fire, You lend him your garden hose. You don't demand payment before he can save his home. Lend-Lease transformed the war. Billions of dollars worth of weapons, ships, trucks, and food flowed to Britain. American factories, still recovering from the Depression, roared back to life, producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Workers filled assembly lines. Women joined the workforce in growing numbers. The program not only armed the Allies but revived the U.S. economy, laying groundwork for full mobilization. Yet opposition remained fierce. Isolationists decried Lend-Lease as a step toward war. In fiery speeches, Lindbergh claimed Roosevelt was dragging the nation into conflict. Congress debated fiercely, but Roosevelt's framing of aid as essential for American defense carried the day. Public opinion, swayed by newsreels of the Blitz and sympathy for Britain, slowly shifted toward support. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy involvement deepened. Roosevelt ordered neutrality patrols in the Atlantic, effectively escorting convoys. American destroyers clashed with German U-boats. In September 1941, the USS Greer exchanged fire with a submarine. In October, the USS Kearney was torpedoed, killing 11 sailors. The USS Reuben James was sunk with over 100 dead. These incidents pushed the United States closer to open conflict, even as Roosevelt insisted America was not at war. For Britain, American aid was lifeline. Supplies arrived just as resources ran out. Lend-Lease aircraft flew in the skies of the Battle of the Atlantic. American trucks carried soldiers across deserts in North Africa. Food shipments kept civilians from starvation. Churchill later wrote that Lend-Lease was the most unsordid act in history. Roosevelt walked a fine line. He reassured Americans that their sons would not be sent into foreign wars while quietly preparing the nation for the day neutrality could no longer be maintained. By the end of 1941, the United States was still technically at peace, but its factories, shipyards, and convoys were already fighting a war in all but name. What if the fate of nations rested not on battlefields, but beneath the cold, dark waves of the Atlantic? Between 1940 and 1941, Germany's U-boats prowled the seas in growing numbers, threatening to choke Britain into submission. It was a campaign of stealth, endurance, and terror, where sailors never knew if the next moment would bring survival or sudden destruction. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun the moment war was declared, but after the fall of France in June 1940, the threat grew exponentially. With French ports such as Lorient and Brest under German control, U-boats could launch directly into the Atlantic, avoiding the narrow choke points of the North Sea. This allowed Wolfpack's coordinated groups of submarines to operate farther, longer, and deadlier. Britain depended on imports. Grain, fuel, munitions, and raw materials flowed across the ocean from the United States, Canada, and the Empire. Without them, the island nation would starve its war industry, grind to a halt. Every convoy mattered. German Admiral Karl Dönitz understood this perfectly. He believed U-boats could bring Britain to its knees before American power could be mobilized. U-boat warfare was merciless. At night, submarines surfaced to attack with torpedoes and deck guns. Convoys erupted in fireballs as tankers and freighters exploded. Survivors clung to debris in freezing water, often left to perish. Sailors spoke of the horror of hearing torpedoes racing toward them, the hiss, the impact, the thunderous detonation. For the Germans, success was measured in tonnage sunk. In 1940 alone, more than 1,000 Allied ships were lost. By early 1941, the pace quickened. Wolfpacks, coordinated by radio, overwhelmed convoys, striking from multiple angles. Escorts fought valiantly, but their numbers were too few. Depth charges exploded in dark seas, sometimes killing, sometimes missing. The ocean became a graveyard of ships and men. The Allies adapted slowly. Convoy systems first introduced in World War I were reinstated. Merchant ships sailed in groups protected by destroyers and corvettes. Aircraft patrolled coastal waters, yet vast stretches of the Atlantic remained uncovered, especially the Black Pit in the mid-ocean, beyond the range of land-based planes. There U-boats hunted with impunity. Life aboard a U-boat was brutal. Crews endured weeks underwater in cramped, foul-smelling conditions. Fresh air was scarce food, spoiled quickly, and the constant tension of combat weighed heavily. Yet German submariners fought with grim efficiency. Propaganda hailed them as knights of the deep, but in reality they lived in filth and fear, knowing their chances of survival diminished as the war dragged on. For Britain, the toll was severe. Imports fell, rationing tightened. Civilians queued for bread, tea, and fuel. Churchill admitted the U-boat threat was the greatest danger Britain faced. If convoys could not get through, the war was lost. Every successful crossing became a small victory in itself. Across the Atlantic, American involvement deepened. Though officially neutral, the U.S. Navy patrolled convoy routes. Roosevelt ordered shoot-on-sight directives after clashes. In September 1941, the USS Greer exchanged fire with a German submarine. In October, the USS Kearney was torpedoed, killing 11 sailors. Weeks later, the USS Reuben James was sunk, taking over 100 lives. Public outrage grew. Though America was not yet at war, its sailors were already dying in the Atlantic struggle. Technology began to shift the balance. Allied scientists improved sonar detection. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted and decrypted German naval communications, providing intelligence on U-boat movements. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ships, began to provide air cover in mid-ocean. These innovations were still in their infancy in 1941, but they hinted at how the tide might one day turn. For now, however, the U-boats had the upper hand. Convoy after convoy limped into British ports, missing ships, their decks filled with weary survivors. Newspapers carried lists of sunken vessels. The seas seemed to belong to Germany. Yet, even in this darkest period, the Allies learned resilience. Crews adapted. Escort groups became more coordinated. Slowly, painfully, the experience gained in 1940-41 built the foundation for eventual victory. The U-boat war was more than numbers and ships. It was psychological. For British civilians, every siren of an air raid was terrifying, but every report of a convoy's arrival was relief. For sailors, every voyage was a gamble with death. For Roosevelt and Churchill, the Atlantic became the thread binding their nations closer. The United States was still neutral, but its lifelines of ships and supplies already flowed, defended by its navy tested in blood. The struggle for the Atlantic would not end for years, but by 1941 it was clear the outcome of the entire war depended on whether supply ships could cross the ocean. Britain's survival, America's role, and the future of freedom all hung on the waves. What if the key to defeating Hitler's war machine was not only steel and firepower, but brains and secrecy? While soldiers battled in trenches and sailors fought at sea, another war raged in silence, the war to break German codes. In a quiet English estate called Bletchley Park, mathematicians, linguists, and engineers worked in secrecy to unlock the Enigma machine. Their success would become one of the greatest secrets of the war. The Enigma machine was Germany's cipher device, a typewriter-like machine with a complex system of rotors and plug boards. Each keystroke scrambled into a different letter, producing codes that changed daily. With trillions of possible settings, it seemed unbreakable. German commanders trusted Enigma, absolutely using it to direct U-boat wolf packs, move panzer divisions, and coordinate air raids. They believed their messages were secure, beyond reach. But even before the war, others had begun to pry open Enigma's secrets. In the 1932nd Polish cryptographers, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henryk Zygalski made the first breakthroughs. Using brilliant mathematics and a replica machine, they cracked early versions of the cipher. As Germany's invasion loomed in 1939, they shared their knowledge with Britain and France. This gift became the seed of Allied code breaking. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion north of London, Britain assembled its brightest minds. Mathematicians, chess champions, crossword experts, and linguists were recruited. Among them was Alan Turing, a young Cambridge mathematician with unconventional brilliance. Turing saw patterns where others saw chaos. He designed electromechanical machine bombs that could test thousands of Enigma settings, rapidly searching for the correct configuration each day. Life at Bletchley was grueling and secretive. Thousands of men and women, many young recruits from universities, worked around the clock. Huts across the estate buzzed with activity. Intercepted German messages captured by radio operators arrived daily. Teams sifted through them, searching for openings, repeated phrases, operator mistakes, weather reports. Once cracked, the messages were translated and passed to military commands. The work demanded precision, patience, and absolute secrecy. The results, codenamed Ultra, were extraordinary. By 1940, Bletchley was reading Luftwaffe communications during the Battle of Britain, giving the RAF insights into enemy raids. Later, they penetrated U-boat messages, providing convoy routes and hunting grounds. Ultra did not stop the U-boat war immediately, but it saved countless ships by directing escorts to danger zones. As the war continued, the intelligence widened to cover every branch of the German military. The secrecy was absolute. Few outside the highest levels of government knew Ultra existed. Even commanders receiving the intelligence were told only that it came from a special source. To protect the secret, some ships and convoys were left to their fate. Better to sacrifice them than risk revealing to the Germans that Enigma was compromised. Turing and his colleagues worked in near anonymity, yet their breakthroughs were pivotal. The machines at Bletchley became precursors to modern computers, laying foundations for the digital age. But in 1940-41, their purpose was singular: to shorten the war and save lives. Meanwhile, Germany continued to improve Enigma, adding complexity with new rotors and procedures. Each change forced Bletchley into new races of intellect versus machine. The struggle was never-ending, but determination held. Every decrypted message was a victory of human ingenuity over tyranny. For those at Bletchley, the pressure was immense. They worked long shifts with little recognition, unable to share their burden even with family. Yet camaraderie grew. Friendships formed over tea in crowded huts. Despite secrecy, a spirit of mission bound them. They believed correctly that their work mattered as much as any battle. By 1941, ultra-intelligence had begun to shape the war. Convoys survived that might have been lost. RAF raids struck targets with uncanny precision. Churchill, privy to Ultra, called Bletchley his geese that laid golden eggs and never cackled. He understood that this silent war of the mind was tipping the scales. For ordinary Britons, the war was measured in rations, sirens, and rubble. They never knew that hidden in a country estate, brilliant minds were fighting for them with logic and wires instead of guns. Only decades later would the truth emerge, revealing that the quiet work at Bletchley had saved millions. In the early years of World War II, while Blitzkrieg raged and U-boats prowled, an invisible front decided the survival of Britain. It was fought not in trenches but in codes. What if a dictator's hunger for glory dragged his nation into disaster and forced his more powerful ally to clean up the mess? In 1940 and 1941, Benito Mussolini, eager to prove Italy's strength, launched invasions in North Africa and Greece. Instead of triumph, he found humiliation, exposing the weakness of fascist Italy and tying Hitler's fortunes to risky new fronts. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, Mussolini boasted that he needed only a few thousand dead to sit at the peace table. He dreamed of empire in the Mediterranean, calling it Mare Nostrum, our sea, reviving the glory of Rome. But Italy's military, though large, was poorly equipped. Tanks were outdated aircraft, underpowered, and logistics chaotic. Soldiers fought bravely, but their leadership and supplies lagged far behind Germany's standards. The first test came in North Africa. From Libya, then an Italian colony, Mussolini's forces eyed British-held Egypt. In September 1940, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani led 2,000 troops across the desert. They advanced a short distance, built makeshift forts, and stalled. The Italians lacked fuel trucks and modern armor. Their advance was tentative, cautious. The British struck back with stunning efficiency. In December 1940, General Richard O'Connor led Operation Compass, a counter-offensive with just 3,000 men. Using speed, surprise, and coordination, British and Commonwealth troops smashed through Italian defenses. Over 1,300,000 Italians were captured, along with vast supplies of weapons and vehicles. Entire divisions crumbled. The campaign was a humiliation for Mussolini, exposing Italy's weakness before the world. But his ambitions were not confined to Africa. In October 1940, he launched another gamble, an invasion of Greece from occupied Albania. Mussolini resented playing second fiddle to Hitler and sought an independent victory to showcase Italian power. Hitler always makes me feel like a poor relation, he complained. Determined to change, that he ordered the attack without consulting Berlin. Italian troops crossed the mountainous Greek border on the 28th of October 1940. They expected an easy triumph against the small Balkan nation. Instead, they met fierce resistance. Greek soldiers fighting on home ground drove them back. In freezing winter conditions, the Greeks counterattacked, pushing deep into Albania. Italian forces were demoralized, poorly supplied, and suffering from the elements. The campaign turned into a debacle. The embarrassment forced Hitler's hand. In early 1941, German forces prepared to invade the Balkans to rescue their faltering ally. For Hitler, this was an unwelcome distraction. His main focus was the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Yet Mussolini's failure in Greece delayed those plans and forced Germany into new commitments. The overreach also extended to East Africa, where Italian colonies in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somaliland were quickly overwhelmed by British and Commonwealth troops. By early 1941, Italy's empire in Africa was collapsing. What Mussolini had hoped would be a showcase of fascist power became proof of incompetence. At home, propaganda tried to mask the defeat. Mussolini appeared on balconies delivering fiery speeches. Newspapers boasted of victories that did not exist. Yet Italian soldiers and their families knew the truth. Morale fell. Many Italians began to question the Duce's leadership, though opposition was still dangerous under dictatorship. For Germany, Italy's failures were costly. Hitler had to send Erwin Rommel with the Afrika Korps to stabilize North Africa. In Greece and the Balkans, German divisions diverted resources from the east. Mussolini had promised partnership, but he delivered dependency. Italy became a liability, its blunders pulling Germany into wider, riskier wars. For the Allies, however, Mussolini's overreach offered opportunity. The Greek resistance became legendary, inspiring other occupied peoples. British propaganda highlighted Italian failures to undermine Axis unity. The setbacks also proved that fascist armies were not invincible. By 1941, Mussolini's dream of empire lay in tatters. His reckless ambition had dragged Italy into humiliations that weakened the Axis and strained his alliance with Hitler. Italy would continue to fight, but its role was no longer as a bold equal. It was the junior partner propped up by German strength. The story of Mussolini's overreach was more than one dictator's hubris. It was a turning point that revealed the fragility of Axis power and foreshadowed the costly entanglements that would eventually drag Germany down. What if the fate of continents was decided not only by battles, but by uneasy alliances between dictators with clashing ambitions? In 1940 and 1941, Germany, Italy, and Japan formalized their partnership in the Tripartite Pact, forging what became known as the Axis powers. On paper, it looked like a united front against the democracies of the world. In reality, it was an alliance of convenience, fragile beneath the surface, but still powerful enough to plunge the globe into wider war. By the fall of 1940, Hitler stood triumphant in Europe. France had fallen. Britain stood battered but unbroken. Italy, despite humiliations in Greece and North Africa, was still aligned with Germany. Across the world, Japan was expanding in Asia, hungry for resources. It was in this context that diplomats from Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo signed the Tripartite Pact on the 27th of September 1940. The pact pledged that if any of the three was attacked by a nation not already at war, an implicit warning to the United States, the others would come to its defense. The propaganda hailed the pact as a new world order. Nazi films portrayed it as a union of powerful civilizations, Germany ruling Europe, Italy dominating the Mediterranean, and Japan controlling Asia. Mussolini declared it the formation of an axis around which the world would turn. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Germany and Italy shared geography and ideology, yet they did not share strength equally. Mussolini's blunders had already forced Hitler to divert troops to bail out his ally. Hitler respected Mussolini personally, but viewed Italy as the weaker partner. For Mussolini, the alliance was both protection and humiliation. Japan's position was even more complex. Its war in China had dragged on since 1937, consuming resources and bogging down armies. The Japanese militarists saw Germany's lightning victories in Europe as proof that bold aggression could succeed. They hoped an alliance with Berlin would intimidate the United States and Britain, securing their dominance in East Asia. Yet Hitler viewed Japan as a useful distraction for America, not as an equal partner. Their interests overlapped but rarely aligned perfectly. Strategically, the Axis alliance presented the Allies with a nightmare scenario, A global conflict fought across Europe, Africa, and Asia simultaneously. German U-boats and battleships threatened the Atlantic. Italian forces, though weaker, contested the Mediterranean. Japan loomed over the Pacific. The democracies were forced to think globally, stretching resources to multiple fronts. Still, the Axis lacked the cohesion of the Allies. There was no central command, no true coordination between theaters. Hitler made decisions based on his ambitions in Europe. Mussolini pursued Mediterranean dreams. Japan sought dominance in Asia and the Pacific. Often their strategies conflicted rather than complemented. For example, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin in 1939, even as Japan fought bitter clashes with Soviet forces on the Mongolian border. By 1941, Germany was preparing to invade the USSR, while Japan turned south towards Southeast Asia. Their paths diverged, even as their pact held on paper. For Britain and the United States, the Axis alliance was a warning. Roosevelt condemned it as an attempt to dominate the world by force. Churchill saw it as proof that the war was global, not regional. Yet, both also recognized its weaknesses. If the Allies could hold out, the disunity within the Axis might be exploited. On the ground, the tripartite pact emboldened aggression. Germany pushed deeper into the Balkans to secure its flank. Italy clung to its campaigns in Africa. Japan pressed into French Indochina in 1940, alarming Washington. Each move stretched the world closer to wider war. For ordinary people, the Axis alliance meant fear. Civilians in Britain and China alike faced bombing raids. Families in Greece, Ethiopia, and Poland endured occupation. The pact symbolized not just political agreements, but the shared brutality of fascist and militarist regimes. By early 1941, the Axis appeared unstoppable. Three great powers promised mutual support, and their enemies seemed cornered. But the alliance, though fearsome, was built on fragile foundations. Hitler pursued domination of Europe at all costs. Mussolini grasped for relevance despite weakness. Japan eyed American bases in the Pacific with growing hostility. Their unity was less about common vision and more about shared enemies. The world would soon learn that even flawed alliances could wreak immense destruction, and as the Axis tightened its grip, the next targets of aggression were already being chosen. What if the world's largest nation, led by one of history's most ruthless dictators, gambled that it could cooperate with Hitler and survive? Between 1939 and 1941, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union walked a perilous path. Bound by pact to Nazi Germany, the USSR expanded its borders and gained time to rebuild. But beneath every handshake with Hitler lay suspicion, and both sides knew the alliance was temporary. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 stunned the world. The treaty publicly promised non-aggression between Germany and the USSR. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Within weeks, the pact was tested. Germany invaded Poland from the west, and on the 17th of September, the Red Army crossed from the east. In a rare show of cooperation, German and Soviet troops met in the middle staging joint parades in conquered towns. Poland was carved apart, its people subjected to occupation by two brutal regimes. For Stalin, the benefits seemed clear. The USSR regained territories lost after World War I. Western Ukraine and Belarus were annexed. In November 1939, Soviet forces invaded Finland in the Winter War, hoping to push the border away from Leningrad. Though the Finns resisted fiercely and inflicted heavy losses, they were eventually forced to cede territory. In 1940, the Red Army moved again, occupying the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and annexing parts of Romania. The Soviet Union grew larger than ever before. Yet the alliance with Hitler was uneasy. Stalin trusted no one, least of all the Nazis. He believed war with Germany was inevitable, but hoped to delay it. The USSR used the breathing space to expand industry, relocate factories east of the Urals, and build its army. Soviet planners worked feverishly to modernize, but purges of the officer corps in the late 1932nd had decimated military leadership. Thousands of experienced commanders had been executed or imprisoned, leaving the Red Army weakened even as it expanded. Meanwhile, trade flowed between the partners. The USSR shipped Germany vital resources, grain oil, manganese, and other raw materials, helping fuel Hitler's war machine. In return, Germany provided industrial equipment and technical expertise. To outsiders, it looked like cooperation. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin knew it was temporary expediency. Hitler, for his part, never viewed the pact as permanent. To him it was a tactical pause, a way to avoid fighting on two fronts while crushing the West. In Mein Kampf, he had written of Lebensraum, living space in the East. The Soviet Union, with its vast lands and resources, was his ultimate prize. While he shook Stalin's hand in Moscow, he was already planning its conquest. By 1940, as Germany's victories mounted in Western Europe, tensions grew. Soviet leaders pressed for influence in the Balkans and the Black Sea. Hitler, irritated, saw them as rivals. In November 1940, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov traveled to Berlin. Bombs fell on the city during his visit, forcing Hitler and Molotov into air raid shelters. Molotov bluntly asked about Soviet claims in Eastern Europe. Hitler gave evasive answers. Both men left the talks convinced that war was approaching. Stalin misread Hitler's intentions, convinced the Führer would not risk attacking while Britain still resisted. Stalin ignored warnings. Even as German divisions massed on the Soviet border in early 1941, Soviet intelligence reported suspicious movements. Stalin dismissed them as British provocations designed to drag the USSR into war. Ordinary Soviet citizens lived under propaganda that portrayed Germany as a friendly partner. Newspapers published smiling photographs of German and Soviet officials. But whispers of unease spread. Soldiers on the frontier noticed the build-up. Refugees from Poland told of German brutality. Few dared speak openly, but suspicion simmered. By June 1941, the uneasy alliance was nearing its end. The USSR had expanded its territory, secured raw materials, and gained nearly 2 years of preparation. But it had also lulled itself into a false sense of security. Stalin, paranoid yet cautious, hoped to delay confrontation. Hitler, bold and reckless, was ready to strike. The collision between these two regimes would soon become the largest and bloodiest front in human history. What if one dictator's blunders forced another to divert his armies and alter the timetable of the entire war? In the spring of 1941, Adolf Hitler turned his armies south to rescue Mussolini's faltering campaigns in the Balkans. The result was swift conquest, but at a cost, a delay in launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It began with Mussolini's failed invasion of Greece in October 1940. Expecting quick victory, Italian forces pushed across the Albanian border, only to be thrown back by determined Greek resistance. Through the winter, Italian troops were trapped in grueling mountain battles, suffering heavy losses. By March 1941, Mussolini's army was humiliated, and Hitler could no longer ignore the situation. German prestige was at stake. If the Balkans remained unstable, Britain might gain a foothold there, threatening Germany's southern flank. Hitler planned a swift strike. His forces would sweep through Yugoslavia and Greece, securing the region, before turning east to the Soviet Union. The timetable was tight, but Hitler believed German efficiency could manage both campaigns. The crisis escalated in March 1941 when Yugoslavia, pressured by Berlin, reluctantly signed the Tripartite Pact, joining the Axis. 2 days later, however, anti-German officers staged a coup in Belgrade, overthrowing the government. Crowds filled the streets waving British flags and chanting defiance. Furious Hitler ordered Yugoslavia's destruction. On the 6th of April 1941, German forces launched simultaneous invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece. The assault was overwhelming. Luftwaffe bombers flattened Belgrade in savage raids, killing thousands. Panzer divisions sliced through Yugoslav defenses. The campaign lasted barely 2 weeks. By the 17th of April, Yugoslavia surrendered its army, crushed its country, dismembered, and occupied by Axis powers. Greece, too, faced disaster. British and Commonwealth forces rushed in to aid the Greeks, but they were too few. German troops advanced rapidly through mountain passes, outflanking defenses. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing cities and harbors. On the 27th of April, Athens fell. German soldiers raised the swastika over the Acropolis, a chilling symbol of occupation. Yet the campaign did not end there. In May, German paratroopers launched a daring assault on Crete, dropping by the thousands from the sky. It was the first large-scale airborne invasion in history. The defenders, British, Greek, and New Zealand troops, fought fiercely. Local civilians, armed with farm tools, joined the resistance. But after brutal fighting, the island fell. Germany had triumphed, but at enormous cost. Thousands of elite paratroopers were killed. Hitler, shaken by the losses, vowed never again to use large-scale airborne assaults. The Balkan campaign seemed a swift victory, but it carried hidden consequences. The diversion delayed Operation Barbarossa by several crucial weeks. Instead of striking the Soviet Union in May, German armies did not launch until late June 1941. The delay would prove fateful as winter descended before Hitler could achieve his goals in Russia. For the peoples of the Balkans, occupation brought suffering. Yugoslavia was torn apart with brutal puppet regimes and resistance movements emerging. In Greece, famine struck as Axis forces requisitioned food. Civilians endured repression, executions, and hardship. Yet resistance also grew. Partisans in Yugoslavia, led by figures like Josip Broz Tito, waged guerrilla war that tied down German divisions for years. In Greece, bands of fighters retreated to the mountains, launching sabotage and ambushes. For Mussolini, the campaign was a humiliation masked by German success. His reckless ambitions had required Hitler's rescue. Italy's role in the Axis slipped further into dependency. For Hitler, it was a reminder that alliances carried burdens as well as benefits. He had conquered the Balkans, but at the cost of time, troops, and resources. For Britain, though, defeated in Greece, the campaign had symbolic value. Churchill hailed the bravery of Greek defenders and the sacrifice of Commonwealth troops. The message was clear. Not all nations would bow to Hitler without a fight. By summer 1941, the Balkans lay under Axis control. Yet the triumph contained seeds of future trouble, stubborn resistance movements, costly commitments, and a delayed timetable for Hitler's greatest gamble in the East. The conquest was swift, but its consequences would ripple through the rest of the war. What if the greatest gamble of Hitler's career unleashed the largest and bloodiest campaign in human history? On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany shattered its pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa. In one stroke, Hitler opened the Eastern Front, where tens of millions would fight, suffer, and die. The invasion began with breathtaking speed and ferocity, but it awakened a giant that would ultimately prove decisive. At dawn, 3 million German soldiers surged across an 1,800-mile front, supported by 6 00000 vehicles, 3 000 tanks, and nearly 2 000 aircraft. It was the largest invasion ever mounted. Without a declaration of war, German artillery thundered across the border. Luftwaffe squadrons roared east, destroying hundreds of Soviet planes still on the ground. Columns of Wehrmacht panzers sliced forward, overwhelming border defenses. Stalin, caught by surprise, despite repeated warnings, refused to believe an attack was imminent until it was underway. The plan was ambitious. Hitler divided his forces into 3 army groups. Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the largest, drove toward Moscow. Army Group South swept into Ukraine, aiming for Kiev and the resource-rich farmlands. The strategy was blitzkrieg on an unprecedented scale: encircle, annihilate, and move forward relentlessly. In the opening weeks, German victory stunned the world. Soviet forces, poorly led and disorganized after Stalin's purges of the officer corps, collapsed in massive encirclements. At Bialystok and Minsk, entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Tens of thousands were killed, hundreds of thousands captured. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles, herded westward under armed guard. By July, German spearheads were deep inside Soviet territory, advancing faster than Napoleon's Grande Armée had a century earlier. Civilians caught in the paths endured terror. Luftwaffe bombers leveled villages and rail yards. Refugees fled eastward with carts, livestock, and whatever they could carry, only to be overtaken by tanks. Massacres followed. The invasion was not only a military campaign but a racial war. Nazi ideology deemed Slavs and Jews subhuman. Einsatzgruppen mobile killing squads followed the army, executing Jews, communists, and other targeted groups by the tens of thousands. For the Soviet Union, the invasion was an apocalypse. Despite the disaster's resistance emerged. In some sectors, Soviet soldiers fought with desperate bravery, slowing the advance. Partisan groups formed in forests, harassing supply lines. Factories were dismantled and shipped east beyond the Urals, safe from capture. Stalin, after days of stunned silence, finally rallied. On July 3, he addressed the nation, calling the conflict a great patriotic war. He urged citizens to fight for our land, our bread, our freedom. Internationally, the invasion changed everything. Britain, now joined by a new ally, declared support for the USSR despite their ideological differences. Churchill, who despised communism, nevertheless saw Stalin as essential in the fight against Hitler. Roosevelt, too, expanded aid, extending Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviets. The war had truly become global. By August, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles. Army Group South captured vast swathes of Ukraine. Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad. Army Group Center pushed toward Smolensk gateway to Moscow. Yet success carried strains. Supply lines stretched thin across primitive roads. Soviet resistance stiffened. Losses mounted. The Wehrmacht had expected quick victory, but the Red Army, though battered, refused to collapse completely. Still, Hitler remained confident. He believed one final push would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. He spoke of Moscow falling like Paris of the East, becoming Germany's new frontier. Yet already signs of overconfidence and overreach were emerging. The vastness of Russia, the resilience of its people, and the brutality of the campaign foreshadowed a struggle unlike anything Germany had faced. Operation Barbarossa began as a triumph of speed and surprise. But in opening the Eastern Front, Hitler had gambled on a war of annihilation against a foe larger, harsher, and more determined than he imagined. The campaign had started in fire. It would end years later in ice and ruin. What if a city of millions was starved, bombed, and frozen for years, yet refused to surrender? In September 1941, German forces encircled Leningrad, the cradle of the Russian Revolution, home of culture and industry. What followed was an ordeal almost beyond comprehension, 872 days of siege, hunger, and death. Yet against all odds, the city endured, symbolizing Soviet resilience in the face of annihilation. Army Group North advanced rapidly through the Baltic states, aiming for the historic city on the Neva River. By late summer, German divisions closed in from the south, while Finnish forces pressed from the north. On the 8th of September 1941, the last supply route was cut. Leningrad was surrounded. Hitler ordered the city not to be captured, but erased. Artillery and bombers pounded it daily. Food and fuel ran out. Winter descended. Inside the city, nearly 3 million civilians were trapped. The ration system collapsed. Bread rations fell to 125 grams per day for workers, less for others. Even that bread was mixed with sawdust or cellulose to stretch supplies. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. People boiled wallpaper paste, ate pets, and scoured frozen parks for edible weeds. Starvation claimed thousands every day. Corpses lay uncollected in the streets, frozen where they fell. By the end of the first winter, hundreds of thousands were dead. Cold was the second killer. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel was gone. Residents burned furniture, books, even floorboards to stay alive. Apartments became icy tombs. Frostbite and disease spread. Hospitals overflowed with the weak and dying. Yet the city's defenses never crumbled. Factories continued producing weapons. Artisans crafted parts for tanks and artillery in unheated workshops. Musicians performed even as bombs fell. In August 1942, the starving Leningrad Radio Orchestra played Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, broadcast across the city and even to German lines. It became a defiant cry of survival. Relief came only in fragments. Across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, the road of life was carved each winter. Trucks, sledges, and even people on foot carried supplies in and evacuated children. The route was perilous. German aircraft and artillery targeted it constantly, but it was the city's lifeline. Each spring, when ice-melted barges replaced trucks, still the supplies were never enough. The siege became a war of attrition. German troops, unable to storm the city, settled into blockade and bombardment. Civilians bore the brunt. Families recorded diaries of hunger, noting the deaths of loved ones one by one. Some accounts describe parents too weak to bury children, neighbors trading scraps of food to survive another day. By conservative estimates, over 1 million civilians died during the siege, mostly from starvation. Yet surrender never came. Stalin ordered the city to hold at all costs. Soviet armies launched counter-offensives, gradually pushing German lines back. Partisans harassed supply routes. After fierce battles in late 1943, the siege was finally broken in January 1944. The Red Army drove the Germans away, ending one of the longest blockades in history. Survivors wept in relief, though the scars of loss would remain forever. For the world, the siege of Leningrad became a symbol of human endurance under unimaginable conditions. It showed that even when reduced to hunger and despair, a city could resist annihilation. For the Soviets, it became a rallying legend, proof that Hitler's dream of quick victory in the East was an illusion. For the Allies, the endurance of Leningrad demonstrated that the Soviet Union, though battered, would not collapse. This meant Germany faced the long grinding war it had hoped to avoid. The frozen streets of Leningrad, littered with silent victims, told a story that shaped the fate of the conflict, resilience stronger than starvation. What if Hitler's lightning war, which had crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe, finally met an enemy it could not break? In the winter of 1941 German armies reached the gates of Moscow, the Soviet capital, only to be halted and thrown back. The battle for Moscow became the turning point that shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Operation Barbarossa had advanced with astonishing speed through the summer of 1941. By autumn, German troops had captured Smolensk and approached within striking distance of Moscow. Hitler believed seizing the Soviet capital would end the war in the East. Moscow was not only the heart of Soviet government, but also a vital rail hub and industrial center. Its fall, Hitler thought, would topple Stalin's regime. In October, Operation Typhoon, the offensive against Moscow began. German panzer divisions surged forward, encircling massive Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. Propaganda in Berlin declared victory imminent. German generals believed Moscow would fall within weeks. Civilians in the capital prepared for evacuation. Panic spread as refugees flooded the city, carrying possessions on carts clogging roads. But as German columns advanced, two enemies emerged, Soviet resilience and the Russian winter. The Red Army, though battered, refused to collapse. Fresh troops arrived from Siberia, redeployed after Soviet intelligence learned Japan would not attack from the east. These divisions, hardened to freezing conditions, played a crucial role. Stalin, refusing to abandon the city, remained in Moscow. His decision to stay stiffened resolve. The weather turned brutal. Rain turned roads into seas of mud, bogging down trucks and tanks. Horses collapsed in the mire. Then the cold struck. By late November, temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. German soldiers, clothed in summer uniforms, froze in trenches. Engines refused to start. Weapons jammed. Frostbite maimed thousands. Supplies dwindled as stretched lines failed to keep up. Still, German forces pressed to within sight of Moscow's outskirts. Villages just miles from the Kremlin fell. Residents could hear the thunder of artillery. The Red Square, prepared for defense barricades, built civilians mobilized. Yet even as danger loomed, Stalin ordered the annual 7th of November parade to proceed. Soldiers marched through the square and went directly to the front. The message was clear: Moscow would not fall. In early December, the Red Army struck back, reinforced by Siberian divisions and bolstered by new tanks and artillery. Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive. The Germans, exhausted and ill-equipped for the cold, reeled backward. Soviet ski troops attacked through forests. Cavalry charges struck retreating columns. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was forced into retreat. The victory electrified the Soviet Union. Propaganda declared that Hitler's armies could be beaten. Across the world, the myth of German invincibility was broken. In London and Washington, hope grew. Churchill called it a turning point. Roosevelt saw proof that the Soviet Union could hold. For German soldiers, the winter of 1941-42 was a nightmare. Diarists described comrades freezing to death in their sleep rations, frozen solid boots disintegrating. What had begun as a campaign of triumph ended in misery. For Soviet civilians, suffering was immense too. Villages burned in the path of retreat. Families starved in the cold. Yet survival of the capital gave strength. Hitler, enraged by the setback, dismissed generals and took direct command of the Eastern Front. He refused to allow retreats, ordering soldiers to stand fast, even in impossible conditions. The failure to capture Moscow did more than deny him a quick victory. It condemned Germany to a long grinding war of attrition it could not win. The Battle of Moscow proved that the Red Army, though battered, could resist and strike back. It showed that Hitler's strategy of lightning conquest had limits, and it marked the beginning of a war on the Eastern Front that would stretch for years, consuming millions of lives. The road to Pearl Harbor was paved by Japan's imperial ambitions. Since the 1,932nd Japanese forces had expanded through China, seeking resources and dominance, the conflict dragged on, consuming men and materials. To secure fuel, rubber, and other vital supplies, Japan eyed Southeast Asia, particularly European colonies, weakened by Germany's victories. But American policy stood in the way. The United States imposed embargoes on oil and steel, hoping to pressure Tokyo to halt aggression. Instead, Japanese leaders viewed embargoes as strangulation. Convinced war with America was inevitable, they decided to strike first. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, designed a plan. A surprise aerial assault would destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor, giving Japan freedom to expand across the Pacific before America could recover. It was a bold gamble, cripple America's navy in one blow, then negotiate from strength. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched over 350 aircraft in 2 waves. At 7:55 a.m., bombs and torpedoes rained down on Pearl Harbor. Battleship Row became an inferno. The USS Arizona exploded when a bomb ignited its magazine, killing over 1,000 sailors instantly. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds. The USS West Virginia and California sank in shallow waters. In minutes, the pride of the Pacific Fleet was devastated. American forces, caught by surprise, scrambled to respond. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, downing some attackers, but too late to prevent destruction. Airfields at Hickam Wheeler and Ford Island were bombed, leaving dozens of planes destroyed on the ground. Smoke and flames filled the sky. Civilians across Oahu watched in shock as explosions shook the harbor. By the end of the attack over 2400, Americans were dead, nearly 1200 wounded, and much of the fleet lay wrecked. Yet, the strike was not total. Crucially, America's aircraft carriers, the true future of naval warfare, were at sea and untouched. Fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and submarines also survived. Japan had dealt a heavy blow, but not a fatal one. The attack electrified the nation. News spread across the mainland within hours. Radio broadcasts carried the president's words the next day. Franklin Roosevelt called the 7th of December a date which will live in infamy. Congress voted for war against Japan with only one dissent. Germany and Italy, bound by the Axis Pact, declared war on the United States days later. Isolationism evaporated. America was now fully in the war on two fronts, committed to total victory. For Japan, the triumph at Pearl Harbor was celebrated with fanfare. Propaganda proclaimed a mighty victory proof of Japanese superiority. Yet Yamamoto himself remained uneasy. He reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He understood America's vast industrial capacity and manpower. If mobilized, the United States could outproduce and outfight Japan. For Americans, the shock turned to resolve. Recruitment surged. Factories shifted overnight to war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Across the country, men lined up at enlistment offices. From a fractured, hesitant nation, America became a united arsenal of democracy. Pearl Harbor also reshaped the global balance. Britain, reeling under German bombing and fighting in North Africa, now had the most powerful ally possible. The Soviet Union, already battling Hitler, welcomed the new front. The Axis, once confident of dominance, now faced a coalition of immense strength. Yet for the men and women of Hawaii, the 7th of December was not just strategy or history, it was terror and loss. Families searched for loved ones in hospitals and among wrecks. Survivors swam through burning oil slicks. Sailors trapped below decks pounded on steel as waters rose. Their sacrifice became the rallying cry of a nation entering its greatest trial. Pearl Harbor was more than a military strike. It was the spark that transformed a global war into a truly world war. What if one dawn raid in Hawaii unleashed a tidal wave across half the globe? After Pearl Harbor, Japan did not pause. Its armies, fleets and air forces surged outward in every direction, striking with astonishing speed. Within months, ancient empires collapsed, islands fell, and millions were under Japanese occupation. For the Allies, the Pacific became a nightmare of defeat and retreat. Even as planes bombed Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, Japanese forces launched coordinated assaults across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within hours, they struck the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, and Wake Island. It was a masterstroke of planning and timing designed to overwhelm before the Allies could react. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur commanded U.S. and Filipino troops. On the 8th of December, Japanese bombers destroyed American aircraft on the ground at Clark Field. Invasion forces landed days later. By January 1942, they pushed defenders onto the Bataan Peninsula. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, and soldiers fought on with little hope. President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia, where he famously vowed, "I shall return." Thousands left behind would endure the Bataan Death March, a brutal forced trek that claimed thousands of lives. Farther west, British Malaya and Singapore became targets. Japanese troops, moving swiftly down the Malayan Peninsula, outflanked British defenses. Despite inferior numbers, they used bicycles and jungle tactics to advance rapidly. By February 1942, Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress, surrendered. Over 8,000 Allied troops marched into captivity, one of the greatest disasters in British military history. Churchill called it the worst humiliation the Empire had ever suffered. Hong Kong fell within weeks, its defenders, overwhelmed by superior Japanese forces. Guam and Wake Island, small U.S. outposts, were also lost. In the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces seized oil-rich territories vital for fueling the war machine. By March 1942, Java had fallen and the Allies' defensive line collapsed. The victories were not only military but psychological. Japan seemed unstoppable. Propaganda declared the creation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, claiming liberation of Asia from Western colonial powers. In reality, Japanese occupation was harsh, marked by brutality, forced labor, and atrocities against civilians. Yet even amid disaster, resistance flickered. On Wake Island, U.S. Marines held out longer than expected, sinking Japanese ships before finally surrendering. In the Philippines, guerrilla fighters continued operations long after official defeat. Across occupied lands, underground movements began to stir. For the Allies, the early months of 1942 were grim. The United States, Britain, and the Netherlands reeled from blow after blow. Naval battles at the Java Sea ended in crushing defeat. Supplies to China, already blockaded, were further strangled. Millions of civilians faced new masters under Japanese rule. But Japan's victories carried risks. Its empire expanded at lightning speed, stretching supply lines thin. Each conquest required garrisons, ships, and resources, and by awakening the United States, Japan had set itself against a foe with industrial capacity far beyond its own. American resolve hardened quickly. Factories converted to war production. Shipyards worked around the clock. Aircraft carriers spared at Pearl Harbor became the spearhead of a new strategy. In April 19, 42 U.S. bombers launched from the carrier Hornet struck Tokyo in the daring Doolittle raid. The material damage was small, but the psychological impact was immense, proof Japan itself was not invulnerable. Meanwhile, Allied commanders searched for a way to halt the tide. Australia's spared invasion became a crucial base. Naval code breakers began deciphering Japanese communications, setting the stage for future victories. The early defeats, though devastating, also taught painful lessons that would reshape Allied strategy. For ordinary people across Asia and the Pacific, the eruption of war brought upheaval. Families fled cities under bombardment. Colonial rulers vanished overnight, replaced by Japanese military governors. In villages, civilians faced forced labor, confiscation of food, and brutal repression. In prisoner of war camps, Allied soldiers endured starvation and abuse. The first months of the Pacific War were a whirlwind of conquest. Japan seemed unstoppable, sweeping aside colonial empires that had dominated Asia for centuries. Yet in its triumphs, it had sown the seeds of its downfall, awakening a giant, stretching its power too thin, and uniting enemies against it. What if the tide of a vast ocean war turned in just a few minutes of fire and smoke? In June 1942, the United States and Japan clashed at Midway, a remote atoll in the Central Pacific. Outnumbered and still reeling from early defeats, the U.S. Navy delivered a decisive blow that shifted the balance of the Pacific War forever. The road to Midway began with Japan's sweeping victories. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces seized territory across Asia and the Pacific. Their next goal was to extend a defensive perimeter, securing dominance before American industry could fully mobilize. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, planned to lure the U.S. fleet into a trap. His target, Midway Atoll, just over 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. Seizing it would threaten Hawaii itself and force the Americans into battle on Japanese terms. But Yamamoto did not know his codes had been compromised. At Pearl Harbor, U.S. cryptanalysts led by Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had broken key elements of Japan's naval code. Through intercepted messages, they learned of the planned strike. To confirm, they devised a clever ruse. Midway was ordered to send an uncoded message claiming its water plant had broken down. Soon, after Japanese communications reported that the target AF was short of water, the trap was revealed. AF meant Midway. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared an ambush. The U.S. Navy could muster only 3 carriers, Enterprise Hornet and the hastily repaired Yorktown, against Japan's 4 elite carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yet forewarning balanced the odds. American carriers positioned northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. On the 4th of June, the battle began. Japanese aircraft bombed Midway, inflicting damage but failing to destroy its defenses. As they prepared a second strike, U.S. planes attacked. The first American waves, torpedo bombers flying obsolete planes, suffered devastating losses. Nearly wiped out, they failed to score hits. But their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the skies above unguarded. Then came the moment that changed history. Around 10:20 a.m., U.S. dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared overhead. With Japanese carriers' decks cluttered with fueled planes and loaded bombs, the timing was perfect. In minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were struck and set ablaze. Explosions tore through hangars, engulfing crews and aircraft. Entire ships became infernos, doomed within hours. Only Hiryu remained operational. She launched counterstrikes, hitting Yorktown with bombs and torpedoes. The carrier was fatally damaged, later sunk by a submarine. Yet by evening, Hiryu too was found and destroyed. Yamamoto, realizing the disaster, ordered retreat. The proud Japanese fleet had lost 4 carriers, the core of its striking power, along with hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots. For the United States, the cost was heavy, but bearable. 1 carrier lost around 300 men dead. For Japan, the defeat was catastrophic. At Midway, they lost not just ships, but momentum. Their advance was halted. No longer would Japan dictate the pace of war. From then on, the initiative shifted to the Allies. The victory electrified America. Only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had avenged its humiliation. Newspapers declared Midway the greatest naval victory since Trafalgar. Morale soared. For sailors and pilots who fought there, the memory of sacrifice remained forever. Etched men who dove through flak into blazing carriers, who never returned but ensured triumph. For Japan, Midway was a wound from which it never recovered. Its shipyards could not replace carriers as fast as American factories could build them. Its pilot training programs could not replace lost veterans. Yamamoto's bold gamble had failed, and the empire would now face a grinding, losing war of attrition. Strategically, Midway was the turning point. It blunted Japanese expansion, preserved Hawaii, and gave the United States the confidence to move on to the offensive. Soon, battles in the Solomon Islands and beyond would carry the war closer to Japan. Midway proved that intelligence, courage, and timing could outweigh numbers. It was the moment the Pacific balance shifted from desperation to determination, from defense to offense. What if the fate of the entire war hinged on a single city by the Volga River? In 1942, Hitler launched his mightiest offensive to seize Stalingrad, a city bearing Stalin's name and symbolizing Soviet pride. The battle that followed became one of the bloodiest in human history. Streets, factories, and ruins turned into killing grounds. By the time it ended in February 1943, the German Sixth Army was annihilated, and the tide of the war had turned. Hitler's goal was twofold: capture Stalingrad to secure the Volga River and seize the oil fields of the Caucasus to fuel his war machine. In the summer of 1942, German armies surged across southern Russia. At first, victories came quickly. Vast territories fell. The Wehrmacht advanced deep into the steppe, its tanks kicking up dust clouds as far as the eye could see. By late August, German forces reached Stalingrad's outskirts. The city stretched along the Volga, a sprawling industrial hub of factories and workers' housing. Stalin ordered it defended at all costs. Reinforcements ferried across the river under constant bombardment. Not one step back became the Soviet command. The result was a battle fought not for ground, but for every street, every building, every room. German bombers leveled much of the city in the opening weeks, reducing neighborhoods to rubble. But the ruins favored defenders. Soviet soldiers used cellars, factories, and broken walls as fortresses. The fighting became hand-to-hand, bayonets, knives, grenades. Snipers hunted from hidden perches. Pavlov's house, an apartment block held by a small group of Soviets, became a legend resisting for weeks. The Volga itself, under constant fire, became a lifeline. Barges ferried troops and supplies across, many sunk in the process. The brutality was staggering. Civilians trapped in the city starved and froze, hiding in basements. German and Soviet soldiers alike fought in appalling conditions. Hunger, exhaustion, and cold gnawed at both sides. Still, Hitler insisted Stalingrad must fall, pouring more men and resources into the fight. For Stalin, retreat was unthinkable. The city's name made it symbolic. Neither leader would yield. By autumn, the Germans controlled most of the city, pushing the Soviets back to the riverbanks. Yet the Red Army prepared a trap. In November 1942, Operation Uranus struck. Soviet forces attacking the weaker flanks held by Romanian and Italian troops broke through north and south of the city. Within days, they encircled the German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men inside Stalingrad. Hitler forbade retreat. He ordered General Friedrich Paulus to hold out, promising relief. Luftwaffe airlifts failed, unable to supply the army's needs. Food and ammunition ran out. Winter closed in temperatures plunging below zero. Soldiers froze in trenches, wounded lay untreated, and discipline broke down. Starvation gnawed relentlessly. In January 1943, the Soviets launched their final assault. Street by street, they crushed resistance. On the 31st of January, Paulus, recently promoted to field marshal, surrendered. Hitler had urged him to die rather than be captured, but Paulus refused. By the 2nd of February, all resistance ceased. Of the hundreds of thousands who entered Stalingrad, only a fraction survived captivity. The victory electrified the Soviet Union and the Allies. For the first time, a major German army had been destroyed in its entirety. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. From that moment, the initiative shifted. The Red Army began its long push westward, driving toward Berlin. For Germany, Stalingrad was catastrophe. The loss of men, equipment, and prestige was immense. Morale cracked on the home front. Even Hitler's generals began to doubt ultimate victory. For the Soviets, it was proof that endurance and sacrifice could defeat even the most fearsome enemy. Stalingrad was more than a battle, it was a turning point. It showed that Hitler's ambition had limits, that his empire could bleed and break. It marked the moment when the war's tide flowed inexorably against the Axis, setting the stage for Allied offensives on every front.